Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this Sunday. I'm so glad to be here with you as always. And today we are going to do a live Q&A. So I'm just going to be taking audience questions for a few hours today, and I'll try to get in as many as I can. So how it works is that we don't really take questions from the chat. We actually take questions from a special question form on my website. So Wolf will be in the comment section posting that link, and you can just go there and post your question, and it will be selected from there. And that's because we're streaming on multiple different platforms today. And it just make sure that we see your question because we can't, properly monitor all of those chats. All right, so we're going to start out with the first question today from Jay. Hello, Jay. And you said, do you believe angels are extraterrestrials or interdimensional? So this topic seems to be gaining more and more popularity. And in the spiritual scene, we see more and more people talking about spirituality in cosmic terms and in galactic terms. Now, this is right on time for sort of the Aquarian age, that this idea where we begin to consider ourselves and the world in a cosmic sense, or cosmic consciousness, as it was called in earlier periods. So one of the things I think that's going on in modern times is that there's a conflation of a bunch of different phenomenon. Some is technically interdimensional. But remember, the word interdimensional is really not a new concept. The word interdimensional just means spiritual. Okay, so interdimensional contact is the same thing as spiritual contact in earlier periods of human development. There is no difference, right? So if someone's talking about different dimensions or interdimensionals, they're talking about spiritual beings and spiritual planes. That's how you would access that knowledge in earlier periods. Say thousands of years ago, they would be called angels, or in the Eastern traditions, angels would be called devas. There's positive and negative ones, but we're really actually getting at the same phenomenon. And I think it's actually, spiritually speaking, dangerous to start thinking that it's different, because when you do that, you start profaning the topic so badly that it's unrecognizable and it's untrue. And then you basically have to go back and reconsider all this stuff. So I would say that in modern times, there's a conflation of spiritual phenomenon, which is often called interdimensional today, and phenomenon that's not spiritual at all. It's actually from the material plane. Okay. And now the deeper teaching and the teaching that actually lets us understand all of this is the teaching of Lemuria and Atlantis, because what's happening is basically a recapitulation of events and even beings and streams of beings and consciousness that's already happened and is recapitulating. So the real teaching behind this is Lemuria and Atlantis. That's a primary starting place, not the cosmos, right? And the reason being is because in earlier periods of human development, we see that human beings were very different. And in Lemuria, we were almost not even solid, right? And then in Atlantis, we see human beings becoming more and more solid and kind of reaching their peak solidness. And then now we're in a spiritualization arc, right? So if we don't understand that, we will understand nothing about extraterrestrials and interdimensionals and all of that. And that's exactly what's happening, is we are entering into a topic without understanding the condition of the human being and the condition of the earth, and it's causing problems publicly because we don't know how to enter into this topic properly, because you cannot enter into a topic and discuss interdimensional beings or angels without understanding that in Lemuria, basically angels walked amongst human beings, and worked through human beings, and by working through humanity and nature, they basically walked among humanity. And in Atlantis, it was kind of a repeat of the same thing, though humanity was becoming more and more sovereign. And so more and more angels had to work through humanity. So what's happening today is that people have memories of Lemuria. People have memories of Atlantis, of these higher spiritual beings that walked amongst us and really appeared through us, communicated with us in very specific ways. And we're saying, oh yeah, that's happening today in the exact same way, and it's not. So we have to understand that humanity interacted with spiritual beings differently in earlier periods, according to the kind of consciousness that humanity and the earth had. And the kind of consciousness we had was directly related to how solid the earth was and how sovereign human beings was. Now, when people come into the post-Atlantean epoch, which is also called the Aryan epoch in Theosophy and earlier teachings, now humanity has reached peak solidarity. We've already peaked in our materialization in Atlantis, and now we're spiritualizing out of matter. So we have a completely different relationship with angels, which are sometimes called extraterrestrials or interdimensionals, because now we're sovereign beings and we have to actually work very hard in order to perceive them, because now we're trying to pierce through our own shadows in order to interact with that world. When we were unfallen or less individuated, we would see it everywhere. And so this is very, very key to understand. And the second thing to understand is that people are thinking that beings that are living in the shallow cavern system of the earth. Now, I didn't say inner earth, because inner earth is different. Shambhala, Agartha, these are spiritual locations, not a physical inner earth, okay? That's a spiritual location in a different plane that's overlapping with the earth. Okay, that people think is like this whole inner earth thing. It's a conflation again. So in a shallow cavern system in the earth, okay, it's a shallow cavern system. There are beings that you could call a breakaway civilization from Atlantis. And these beings appear and literally will say that they're aliens. They'll say that they're extraterrestrials, and they've been doing it for thousands of years. And the only thing they really have is technology. And so for a very long period of time, people would believe these basically human beings from Atlantis that look very degenerated and have, you know, they may look differently and they're trying to make themselves look very Nordic or whatever. There's a lot of things that we can say about this group that would be hours of lectures long as to what they look like and what's going on there. But suffice to say that there is a group that is wholly earthly, right? It's from Atlantis, which to some people looking back looks like a different world because we operated differently. Certain things were possible in Atlantis that are not possible today, and technology has to be readapted for this particular epoch. But there are beings that are essentially in the shallow cavern system in the earth. It's not the inner earth, right? It's a shallow cavern system. And they have all of this advanced technology that they obsessively work on, but it's really all they have because spiritually they're degenerates. So what they do is they try to fly around and they say, I'm an alien, right? Because they don't want you to know that they're just like the fallen aspect of humanity from earlier periods that's basically in contact with demonic entities. No one's going to listen to you if you say that you're that. So they appear and they abduct people and they do all this disgusting stuff with cattle or whatever. And they say, yeah, I'm an alien and I'm from another world, because then you're enthralled and you think they're a god. And then all of a sudden we see after World War II, the alien god myth starts coming out like crazy, saying, yeah, you need to worship aliens. And then you have all these weird contacts from people who are who are saying, yeah, a ship landed in my backyard, like Van Tassel and all these CIA people, essentially military government people. When you look into their background, they're government contractors. Van Tassel, who had these, aliens land in his backyard, was working at a government military funded airport and said that he saw a bell-shaped craft. 20, 30 years later, through Polish records being released and unclassified, we find out that the Nazis had a bell-shaped craft. And so the problem with the extraterrestrial conversation that just is not being delineated out enough is the reality that we have people, okay, they're people that have advanced technology that are saying, I am an alien. And they've created chimeras and they've created all this weird stuff to make it look like these are aliens, and they have technologies that can affect your mind. They have vibrational technologies. Now, they're not very advanced in like a spiritual sense, but they can basically affect your consciousness to a certain degree. And people feel like they're having spiritual experiences. They feel like they have voices in their heads. What do we do about this in the spiritual community and the ufology community? What are we going to do about this? Are we just going to act like a physical human being showing up in your backyard in a spaceship is a real alien? We have to begin to address the reality that there is a spiritual phenomenon that involves spiritual beings interacting with humanity that has occurred in different ways depending on humanity's development going back millions of years. These are the beautiful memories we have of these higher beings that the darker human groups try to say that they are. And I say human groups because even if they're Atlantean and they have some weird stuff going on, they're ultimately of the earth at this point. They're not alien. If you're living in a cavern system in the earth, you're earthly, right? You're not coming from a different star system. But what I see a lot of is people thinking that these contacts are like spiritual alien contacts, when in reality, this is the elephant in the room, and what are we going to do about it? So angels are being conflated with extraterrestrials for a reason, okay? The word interdimensional and dimensions is just a new modern word for spiritual beings and spiritual planes. Okay, so we have to it's fine to rename things and say, I am going to enter into these classical principles with a new language in order to purify any religious terminology because it may have superstition in it. That's fine. We can't get so far from the spiritual science of the thing that we're profaning it and it's losing meaning and it's just not true anymore, which is what we're seeing a lot of today. Okay, this is a member question. I will be taking member questions along with audience questions. And if you are a member, I'll just say member because we're not going to publicly share your name. Okay, dear Gigi, having heard you speak on this topic many times on your membership Q&As, I'm wondering, would you please speak an assessment of your views for the people who believe in it on the starseed idea, some of who might be open to another view and even belief change on it. Thank you and God bless. Okay, looks like this is going to be a galactic Q&A. That's fine with me. I'm here for it. So as I mentioned, moving into the Aquarian age, it's sort of a cosmic age that kind of characterizes Aquarius a little bit. It's about alienness. It's about cosmicness. And classically, it's about discovering your cosmic consciousness and really yourself beyond your material existence. And so naturally, that kind of wings us out into wanting to understand the planetary spheres and wanting to understand the nature of our soul and our soul's place in the scheme of things. Now, how the soul was actually understood in regards to the soul's level of spiritual initiation and also the soul's process of incarnation and reincarnation was always tracked through the planetary spheres and stars. So we think that in modern times, we think that like the Starseed movement and kind of talking about the soul in relationship to a planet and life on a different planet and life on a different star, we think that that is new. But in reality, that's actually the most classic teaching there is. And every planetary sphere in our solar system has life. This has been clear since the Vedas. This was very clear in Eastern mysticism. People just didn't focus on it at that time because we weren't in the era of focusing on it as we are today. They focused more in the earlier periods in the Eastern traditions more on understanding the body. That's where we get pranayama, yoga. That's where we get all these incredible Saturnian physical understandings of breath, of acupuncture and physicality. We were focused in an opposite direction, but the Eastern mysteries still obviously contained this going back thousands of years, how people from other worlds existed. And you can find it in those texts, though it is talked about very, very differently than it is today, because even 5,000 years ago, people understood that a planetary sphere was a different development of our own planet. It was a different development of the sun, and that all planetary spheres and stars are actually interconnected in some way. In modern parlance, this would be like stargates, right? These are just soul gates. You can't just create whatever stargate you want. There is a pathway, a circuitry in the solar system and in the larger cosmos that is a kind of magnetic, electrical, etheric system that is an exact embodiment of the formation and destruction of worlds. So this is nothing new. In the Western teachings, I mean, so if you look at, you can see it in Gnosticism, you can see it certainly in Theosophy. Theosophy here really as a modernization of Eastern teachings. And then you can see it in Anthroposophy. You can clearly see Rudolf Steiner talking about beings from other worlds. Rudolf Steiner talks about Buddha's mission on Mars as the Christ. And so right there, we get a little piece of that the solar system is really a school, and souls take different lives on different planetary spheres as part of their spiritual initiation process. And the spiritual initiation process is also something that's very obvious. You have a bodhisattva, you have Buddha, you have Christ, you have the process of the soul becoming sovereign and then spiritualized in the image of God. So we have all of these teachings. The problem is that in our society, we become obsessed with novelty, terrified of religion. And a lot of people don't realize that all of these starseed teachings have existed for thousands of years. And it is this drive for novelty, as I was mentioning in my Angels to Aliens lecture last month, that is making people just want to constantly create something new, and in that way kind of glorify themselves as the creator of the new thing. And it's sort of this bizarre situation that's not ideal for teaching, you know, because if something is a true esoteric concept, you're going to see it repeated over and over and over and over again in every civilization that rises and falls. And your understanding of it is going to be basically you being able to understand all of those things to get the big picture. In other words, we don't enter into these teachings from like a modern New Age standpoint or ufology standpoint as though we're reinventing the wheel. That's not how you actually understand these things. That's arrogance. Okay. So the other thing, so in other words, like this idea, I'm a star seed, I come from another world. Well, yeah, because when you pass, your soul ends up passing through every single planetary sphere in the system. And the planet itself, when it goes through its changes, its night and days, it is imbued with cosmic streams from every single planet in the solar system. And there's a transmigration of souls that occurs where souls from certain planetary spheres will begin incarnating in waves at certain times. That is the key of the Starseed movement. But whenever you look into these Starseed teachers, you never get the classical esoteric explanation. You just get these fragments, and it's very difficult for you to actually get a working system that you can use, which is required for you to understand the concept. So in other words, the modern thing to do is to fragment every teaching into these little pieces on like TikTok and Facebook and whatever, and that's not a good way to learn. If you want to understand a concept, you have to understand the entire spiritual science behind the thing. Otherwise, you're only going to be working with these small little fragments, basically. So you can go as cosmic as you want, and do it through spiritual science, and it'll be meaningful because the soul is included. You're not constantly projecting yourself outward into these different planets. And, in the Starseed movement, now, it was different 15 years ago, but now it's like, you see this thing where it's like you don't even identify as a human being anymore. You're like identifying as like a reptilian, or you're identifying as a Pleiadian, or you're identifying as an Arcturian, and you're more Pleiadian than you are human. This is escapism. This is a classical example of escapism. But there's a tiny little bit of truth in it, because the Pleiades star system does send waves of influence and souls to the earth. Arcturus does. But that was a very early period of earthly development. So there's always a little tiny kernel of truth that gets sort of retold and retold and retold. And I think more and more and more and more profaned. And then it gets to a point where it's basically unrecognizable from reality. It's not a concept that if it was like a working part that you could put into your mind and have it work, it would just break down all the time, because it's no longer recognizes it. It no longer has any essence of the original thing, which is something that I think any serious student of esoterica is going to have to address at some point. Okay. Paulette, what is the difference between these three parasitic groups? The Martians in Antarctica, the demonic realm of the eighth sphere, and Ahrimanic forces. Are they different shades of one color? Steiner says that Lucifer gave us free will, a gift to choose to spiritualize our lower nature or not. So do all of these three parasitic groups work together to do this and actually are part of a greater plan? Yes. And I think this is a very important statement, Paulette, because often to teach on a concept, you have to really exaggerate the darkness and the light. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to grasp the differences and the nuances of a concept. But ultimately, whether we're dealing with Lucifer, whether we're dealing with Ahriman, whether we're dealing with the influence of the Martians and fallen angels in general, they do serve ultimately a higher purpose for humanity, because they're being the antagonist, which is the truest meaning of Satan, is they're being an antagonistic force. Now, where it gets kind of difficult is sometimes as human beings, we don't understand how to deal with the antagonistic force. Some people completely try to just avoid it and never look at it, right? Which doesn't work, because you're not integrating it and you just draw it closer to you. And then other people just try to worship the antagonistic force. They become obsessed with Lucifer and they worship Lucifer. They become obsessed with Ahriman, obsessed with the Mars impulse, and they just start to worship it because they feel like through pouring their energy into it, that's integration. By not ignoring it and just by looking at it and actually because they pay so much attention, that's worship, that's going to integrate it. But what you have to do is you have to understand these concepts in their archetypal form, and these beings in their archetypal form, and you have to look for the quality within yourself. So where within you is there a harmonic impulse? Because everybody has a different relationship with the harmonic impulse. You have to say, where in me is there an inverted fallen Mars character? You have to say, where in me is sort of my relationship with perhaps energies in the eighth sphere, right? So it has to be a process within you, and that's what integration is. And when it's integrated, you get very deep memories that come forward in regards to it, and you get clarity and understanding, but only when these concepts are actually integrated into your being. So during the Lemurian period, that period is characterized by the moon, because during Lemuria, we actually see the separation of the moon and the earth. Now, remember, Lemuria is the age of materialization, and the earth is not yet solid. So we see the separation of earth and moon, okay? There's like a little thing. There was like a thought bubble. Did anybody see that? I don't know what that is. I'm just going to carry on. And so during the Lemurian period, there's also a Venus influence. So there's like a lunar influence, and there's a Venus influence. And that's where you get the Lucifer story. And that's where, you get in the Eastern teachings, the teaching of Sunat Kumara, and also in the Theosophical teachings, Sunat Kumara and Lucifer, and the deliverance of free will and mind energy from these Venusian angels. You move forward into Atlantis, and you see the same kind of influence of fallen angels, except this time the fallen angels come through Mars. And so this again gets into almost kind of Starseed teachings, and I think what Starseed teachings are really trying to get at is this influence of angels and fallen angels. That's really at its heart what it is. And so our period now is actually a recapitulation of the Martians coming into Atlantis. And so this is why we're going to see all this high-tech stuff coming in. It is the Martian aspect of the Luciferic impulse, because the Luciferic impulse is not just characterized by Lucifer and the moon in Lemuria. It's also characterized by Luciferic forces working through Mars that eventually came through a kind of lunar passageway in Atlantis. So angels actually fall at various different periods. It's not just in Lemuria at the Garden of Eden with the Luciferic hordes from Venus. There's also ones that fell from Mars in a very different way, in kind of more of an externalized way, which I'm going to get into because that little thing is actually very complicated. Yeah, the eighth sphere as well is essentially, it's basically the influence and place in which all of these characters are ultimately influenced by, and if they do not awaken or change their path, will eventually be absorbed into, if that makes sense. Okay. Member question. How is it that the Belial group doesn't seem to understand that they cannot fix what happened on Mars, that they can't go back, especially if they are aware of mystery teachings? This is a good question, and I think it's a fair question, but I think the answer to this is the initiation. So you can have one person read a spiritual text and they don't understand literally anything in it. Not only do they not understand anything in it, they have like zero interest in finishing it. Okay, so even though the knowledge is there, that person has no interest, right? Which is a big problem. You have to actually have an interest in a topic to enter into it and to understand it. And then you have someone else who has an interest, but that interest may not be pure. So they have an interest in spiritual teachings and in self-development, but that interest is basically self-serving. So they have the intellect developed, or in other words, in Anthroposophy, this is called the intellectual soul. And this was really developed in really getting going in Atlantis in its first rudiments, or manas in the Eastern tradition, kind of lower manas in the Eastern tradition. And they have like an intellect to understand fairly objectively the mechanics of the world and things, but everything has to be basically related back to themselves. What can I get? What can I develop? So there's a selfishness and an ego and a greed behind it. And when a soul is in that condition, they just think everyone is like that. And everything exists for them to basically dominate and absorb power from. And this is called might is right. Okay. Then there is the next level of advancement and initiation, which is actually where you start to become initiated, where you become service-oriented. So you're no longer trying to basically make a ton of money, become famous. You're not trying to basically, every spiritual topic you learn in your life is basically to aggrandize yourself or like manifest something or gain worldly power. When you grow out of that and you realize how kind of sick and dangerous that is for you, you come into a higher level of being. And you begin to become playful again with information. You almost don't really care if you gain worldly power or not, if you're wealthy or not. Like, you realize none of that matters, and you begin to become a really spiritual person. That's when all of the information flows in. Not only that, but you begin to get a spiritual character about you. So that's the difference in people and levels of initiation, is that if you want to actually understand advanced spiritual topics, you have to be loving. And that's the old adage in the Grecian mystery schools, love and wisdom. The more loving that you are, the more wisdom you have. And this means wisdom in the truest sense of the word, which is not only, the secrets of the past, right? Like actual mystery secrets about creation or about other planets, but actually how to live, which actually for most initiates that reach that level is the most important thing. And so the issue is different levels of spiritual initiation. And you can have all these people walking the planet, they all look like human, but within them is a different quality of consciousness. And the Belial group, or dark magicians and the Antichrist impulse, they just don't understand love. They don't understand also the divine feminine, the divine masculine. They don't understand these things. So it's literally, you could sit down with them from a rational perspective, from like a logical perspective, and be like, listen, from a practical perspective, this is why, your perspective is not good. They wouldn't even hear you. It would be like speaking a different language to them. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, is that, what we think of as intelligence is basically like whether you have reading comprehension or not, whether you can memorize something, whether you can kind of like bloviate intelligently. That's not really what intelligence is at all. Intelligence is humanness. And real intelligence is being able to factor in higher dynamics, higher consciousness with your lower. That's real intelligence, right? But we worship like whether you can like debate properly or not, never really tapping into anything truly real. So, okay. Next question is from James. I'm interested in mythology and storytelling. Could you speak about how work by J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were esoterically significant? They were friends and shared ideas with Owen Barfield, who introduced them to Steiner's ideas. Would be really interested in hearing you talk about this. Yes. So both J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, I believe, were Christians and kind of studied esoteric Christianity. Certainly, clearly, C.S. Lewis did. And it's always been a kind of aspect of mystery teachings to have a certain level of the work be myth. So there's an aspect of mystery teachings that is on the nose spiritual science, where you're actually objectively describing higher planes. You're actually objectively trying the best that you can to even describe historical periods of the earth that are basically unknown to us, these kinds of things. But then there's also an aspect which is really going back to humanity's very early development when everything was a story and when humanity had a picture consciousness. And that ability to storytell and to work with myths satisfies that early aspect of ourselves where, even going back to Greece, humanity did not yet fully have the consciousness to objectively understand the spiritual world. We still saw it all around us, and we actually communicated spiritual teachings as stories, and we knew exactly, what we were talking about. Excuse me, guys, I just have to pull this back up. All right. And so in earlier periods, we actually understood things spiritually, naturally, through storytelling and through myths. And that's why we have such a rich history of every single culture telling these bizarre stories that don't make any sense, that if you try to go back to them with like a literalist mindset, you'll just destroy them, because they're such a beautiful little capsule of how humanity operated in this kind of earlier dreamy period. It's actually very beautiful when you think about how we used to operate as basically psychic beings, knowing everything deeply within us, but not objectively yet. So Tolkien and Lewis brought that forward. And I always felt it to be very interesting how Tolkien apparently wrote Lord of the Rings based on some books that he'd found in, I can't remember where he found them, if they were in like a library or an estate, but he actually ended up finding descriptions of an earlier period of Atlantis, of the Earth, which a lot of people think was the pre-flood antediluvian civilization of Atlantis. And during Atlantis, one of the incredible factors about it, and this gets back into why whenever we talk about interdimensional beings and humanity, we have to go back to Lemuria, and we have to understand what consciousness was like then and how we interacted with higher worlds then. We have to go into Atlantis. We have to understand what human consciousness was like then, what we were developing at that point, and then how we interacted with higher worlds then. Because what we see in Tolkien's work is a good example of why that's how we have to teach this, is because Atlantis was the period of the most diversity on the planet. I mean, we have different races in the post-Atlantean epoch, but there were actually different types of people in Atlantis. This is where you get the weird kind of hominids, and you got these different lines that were essentially created through different sexual practices, because Atlantis is also the time of sexual magic, and basically creating these different lines, which would take on a different character. It's not possible to do today, though people become like, think that it is possible. A lot of people think that the kind of magic of Atlantis works today, even though the human being is completely different and the planet's completely different. And so during the Atlantean period, we see like the most diversity on the planet. And then by the end of it, you also get these Belial lords that are creating different, kinds of weird creatures and stuff like that, just like our scientists are doing today, though we're much more limited now what can be done and what can be created compared to Atlantis when we were still more malleable, right? So, the different kinds of people, you have the elves and the dwarves, right, and the humans and the orcs. This is kind of getting into these documents that apparently Tolkien was reading about Atlantis. And then we, of course, and this gets into even the theosophical teachings around Atlantis as well, where the world was separated by these mists, but these mists were not like just water vapor gas. They were actually kind of an etheric mist that separated the earth into different quadrants. And certain beings would appear at a certain time and disappear, and certain land masses would appear at a certain time and disappear. And these were according to different planetary spheres. As the earth was absorbing, again, as I've said, the energies of different spheres. And so this is also where people get the starseed idea, though it's not in like spaceships, right? So you get these different worlds on the earth separated by what's called in Theosophy fire mists. And that is a translation from Eastern teachings. That's a word that even comes from earlier periods. So we're looking at a completely different character of the earth and a completely different character of humanity, almost unimaginable when we go back to Atlantis. The biggest mistake that people make is thinking that Atlantis operated as today does. This is the biggest mistake, because it means you cannot enter into that idea at all. You have to understand the condition of consciousness during Atlantis. We have to understand the condition of the earth in Atlantis, and then we can begin to enter into these ideas. That's the gateway in, because you cannot just project where we are today and apply it to Atlantis. It's impossible. You're going to get a profaned idea, and it's going to lead you nowhere. Okay, so certainly both Tolkien and I think Lewis had, I think that there was also a very natural understanding of spirituality with them and a natural interest. Jung was like this too. But classical writing, I think there's actually a C.S. Lewis book. I think it's him. It's like Pareidolia, and it's literally, I think, about Venus. Like, it's pretty, these are some phenomenal writers that emerged during that period. Okay, dear Gigi, I'm in the process of completing the first bundle of the Inner Mystic course and would like to know what it means to see colors when I close my eyes to meditate. It also happens when I receive acupuncture and massage therapy. I don't have visions like others do. I just see darkness and then swirls of colors, usually purple, red, and green. Could I be seeing my chakras? If so, what does that mean? Actually, you seeing your chakras is pretty insightful, because that actually does happen, especially your Anja or your third eye chakra. A lot of times when you wake up, you will actually see your own energy body, right? But typically in psychic development, when clairvoyance does come online, you usually begin by just seeing shapes. So it can start by actually not even seeing colors, but just actually seeing slight movement of light and dark and gray. And then the more that you affirm this and you say in your mind, I'm seeing grays shifting around, darkness, light, I'm just seeing shapes. You accept it and you affirm it and you're grateful for that. Over time, what will happen is you'll begin to get colors. You may only get one color, like white or like yellow, or you may only get a few colors. And then you acknowledge it and you become thankful for that if you want to continue developing. And then eventually you can get shapes and you'll eventually begin to almost kind of like get a memory, almost like you would remember a memory that will start coming online too, but have a slightly different quality to it. Because it's not just being stimulated by you necessarily, but perhaps by your guides. So there is a unfoldment process to developing your spiritual senses. It's not something that you can really directly control, but the more peaceful you are, the less stressed you are, the kind of wider you become, and always be grateful for whatever is appearing to you. And having a strong routine and discipline also really helps to create that receptive space to develop. Kaylee, I just watched your contact protocol lecture. How would you say your view on your own initial contact experience has changed? The aliens and angels teaching seems slightly different, or at least verbiage used, than that lecture. Would you say your views on the subject have changed or evolved? I would say that I wouldn't say they've changed. I definitely would say that they've deepened. And one thing that I do try to do when I'm teaching is I try to use all of the language that I can at certain points. So I would say that we have to begin linking and understanding that what a lot of people call extraterrestrials today, what they really mean are angels. And why they be called angels, it's not just me as someone who is a Christian mystic. It's not just the fact that I've chosen that mystical path. It's that if you are someone from the West, okay, which means you can't read, Sanskrit, or you can't read like a Tibetan text, right? The most accessible way of studying what happened in earlier periods and our interaction with aliens, which are angels, the way you're going to get into those teachings is through the word angel. So that's going to lead you into basically all of the Western information on what is now called extraterrestrials. A large portion of people who are talking about aliens, they're really talking about what would be called angels classically. So the only way for them to go deeper into their studies and understanding of the material is to use the proper terminology, because then you're going to get into the Dionysius work, which is the spiritual hierarchies. You can get into the Steiner work, and they're all connected to planetary spheres. So for example, what people think are aliens are angels. And the quickest example of this is during the Lemurian period, we see angels from Venus descend to the earth and through their sacrifice give humanity the impulse of mind. You also get the fall of Lucifer in that movement. During Atlantis, you get the fall of these Martian beings. They're basically humans from another world, but we call them angels, right? So that's how you access that information. During Atlantis, you also get you also see a deep mystical secret, which is that the Venusians who did not fall, the angels from Venus that did not fall in Lemuria, actually reached a higher height called Mercury. And this gets you into the meaning of all of those alchemical drawings that have Mercury in there. okay? The liquid metal, mind, the higher tuned mind, okay? That is the graduation of those angels. Some fell, right? Some went into yet even higher heights and became known as Mercury, moving through the sphere of Mercury. Others came through Mars and were fallen yet again. So there's an entire teaching about the other spheres that are really other planes of the earth itself and other developmental periods of humanity that you can only access if you recognize that in the last 2,000 years it's been described through the word angel. So it's not some kind of Christian Puritanism here. It's literally, if you want to access those occult secrets, you have to understand the language. And if you want to be superstitious, or you just, are too afraid to use or use religious language, you're not going to understand the earlier teachings very easily. It exists in the East as well, but sometimes those are harder because consciousness was significantly different 5,000 years ago. So that's why I have preferred now to use the word angel. In earlier lectures, I would use interdimensional, and I would also use extraterrestrial, but in my lecture that's called Contact Protocol, that is specifically about Atlantis. So Contact Protocol is about Atlantean contact. It's not about post-Atlantean contact. It's not even really about the Lemurian period. It is specifically about how during Atlantis, there was a contact protocol in which the high priestesses would interact with higher worlds. And there's a protocol in which that was done. The energies you have to hold in your body, etc. So contact protocol is not about the post-Atlantean period and what's possible now. It's about Atlantis. And it is a lecture that was designed to bring us into that time period, because what's happening is that we remember Atlantis and we remember being able to contact these beings from the saintly realm, which would be ascended masters today, and angels, which were the only way ceremonially you could contact them was to know what sphere, right? And working with those forces, which was also part of yourself. So there was a whole protocol in working with the outer spheres. This is not alien, but that's how people have to, unfortunately, that very profaned idea is how people have to enter back into it, because that's how it's taught 90% of the time now. So from this point forward, I think the best word to use is angel. I don't really see, quite honestly, much of a point in changing the language, because I think it limits the student to what they can study based on that word. But ultimately, people can choose whatever they want. I would say that one of the things that was so incredible to me, because I did have these weird experiences where I was looking back to Atlantis and Lemuria and also seeing different lives associated with different planetary spheres, like this was 20 years ago. I just had no idea what I was looking at. I was seeing advanced technologies, and then whenever I would go and look it up on the internet in a book, they were just like, oh yeah, these are aliens. And so for a long time, I did not even understand what I was seeing. And I fell into the starseed definitions and ideologies, but eventually they just stopped working because they were not parallel with the classical teachings of them. And so now I probably wouldn't even, I think I've given up on that, to be honest. I think in earlier, like a few years ago, I think in my mind, I feel like I wanted to try to work within that paradigm more because it's where I came from. But the more that I've tried, the more distorted I realize it is. And so for me, from this point forward, I would just prefer to work with the classical side of it and touch on those terms and concepts if needed. And that's sort of where I am now. It's just basically, I'm trying to figure out what is the best way to talk about this that is empowering for everyone. And it's a challenge to do because you do want to include more modern terminology. But like we've been discussing today, it does get to a point where it's so profaned and fragmented that I think at a certain point, you just have to walk away. And another example of this is like, because Atlantis was very high tech compared to where we are today, but it was kind of an etheric technology, so in a way different. And part of the Starseed movement, which is actually totally an antichrist impulse, is like, you can just hop in a spaceship and like go to any star system, and you can have these contraptions and gadgets that heal your body. And it's basically like merging with machines, and it doesn't have any room for basically the task that is at hand, which is humanity has to learn to build our resurrection body. And we have to learn how to basically ascend, or we have to learn how to become immortal through spiritual transubstantiation. And yet through the Starseed movement and ufology, you're getting these ideas that it can all be done through machines, that you can just hop into a spaceship and just flash into Arcturus and stuff. No, you can't do that, because what people are talking about when they're talking about the Pleiades and these areas of heaven is you actually have to change your actual form into a form that matches that particular spiritual level of initiation. You can't take a ship there. So you're getting these weird, like technology is basically the savior ideas coming from the Starseed movement and ufology that place technology and these contraptions where the spirit should be. So this is the problem with it, which we'll come to see in the coming decades. Okay, this is a member question. You mentioned recently about the importance of being educated in spiritual science. Would you ever consider setting up a degree course or similar in spiritual science? If you did, I would study it. It feels like it's badly needed now and is the right time. Yes, that is my goal. That is something that I want to do and look forward to doing. I do have more material, course material that will be coming out in the future. But yes, I would love to do that. And I think we do need that. We need a school, a university like school that is, there's no weird cult stuff going on. Like, I don't want to have people like doing my laundry and like, this is weird. Like, there's no weird cult stuff. Okay. It's literally just like a normal school. Like you would take anything else, except it covers spiritual science. That's what's needed. It is studied like you would study anything else. And that is what is needed. Okay. Obviously, it's a little different because there are spiritual effects, but you understand what I'm saying. It should be approached as seriously academically as anything else. When the mind understands, the spirit comes so much easier. Okay. Andres Berman. Dear Gigi, I love how you teach. Could you explain more about what schizophrenia and psychosis is? Is it that all schizophrenics are just people that don't know how to control their psychic abilities, and what would suggest them to be able to gain control over the voices or psychic ability? Yes. So the thing with psychosis and schizophrenia is that it's absolutely sad and tragic, um, how it's being treated today. And I remember actually reading about somebody. This was somebody who was very interested in spiritual topics, and he had this idea that he would go to basically insane asylums and look for basically psychics. And he felt that there were a lot of very powerful mystics that had essentially opened too soon and too fast, which can happen, and had gone into psychosis. And so what happens when someone goes into psychosis from a spiritual perspective is that their higher senses are coming online way too fast. And when your perception changes really fast, and one day the world feels like it's one way, and then the next day it feels like it's something completely different, that brings about in a human being the most intense sense of existential terror and dread. Anybody who has participated in spiritual development knows how that feels on even a small little level, to have your consciousness change through meditation practices, through prayer, to feel how different you feel in your body, to feel how different the world feels to you, not even getting into the voices, not even getting into what you're seeing around people and in the world, just literally how you feel in your body, and how the world just looks to you. It's absolutely terrifying. A lot of people begin psychic development, get a small little taste of the shifts that happen to you psychologically and to your mind when you spiritually develop, and they never continue. In the Eastern ashrams, they would say to you, we very rarely would even, induce people into these different postures or these different sounds that typically open the spiritual organs, because people will have mental breakdowns. So this has always been a very real part of spiritual development, is that sometimes people, they cannot handle it. And so in our modern world, it's tragic because people just get put on medication, they get pushed off to the side, they're called freaks. People are scared of them. These are people who are suffering. These are people who are spiritually suffering, that need real help, not medication. And it's very possible that these are some of the best mystics that need help to develop. And so it's absolutely sad that they are put into that position, because, as I've spoken about on my private platform with the members a lot, is like in an earlier period, in a shamanic period, when people would go through that, they'd say, this is the shaman. This is a wizard, this is a shaman. And they need to be balanced out. And you'd work with a shaman, you'd work with a mystic, and that was trained for that, and you'd get it worked out, hopefully. But once you have that feeling of terror in you, and you're not prepared for it, what ends up happening in psychosis and schizophrenia often is that the feeling of terror that you have, which makes sense, it just attracts to you more and more darker experiences, because the individual doesn't know how to feel peace, and therefore they cannot see peaceful things. And so it's literally very bad mirroring that's going on, because the first thing you learn in psychic development is how to create, or at least how I teach it, is you have to create holy emotions. And we work a lot with the creation of the feeling of awe and reverence. Awe and reverence and holy emotions in the body, love, warmth, things like this. And This allows you to relax enough and become just enough, have just enough lucidity beginning that if something does appear that's a little spooky, there is that separation. But if you can't relax as a mystic, if you can't bring that relaxation into your body, into your mind, you'll feel like you're literally in everything, and you'll have very scary experiences potentially. So mystics actually have to train themselves for usually many, many years to be able to withstand hyperstimulation from the other side often. This one is from a member, and you said, my world has been shaken since learning our past loved ones are basically an astral shell of their former self. The way I've grieved has been based on the comfort that my dad is still with me in spirit, but now I feel like I've completely lost him. It may not be that simple, but I don't want to be clinging to a fantasy. Can I still have a healthy working relationship with him? Where is his I now? And are we connected? Will I be with him again someday? Okay, so this is referring actually to a private Q&A session that I did last week. For those of you who don't know, I do this every Sunday usually, but for members, I go and do a live Q&A and just take members' questions. And this question was about a teaching in Theosophy and Anthroposophy that brought a kind of new angle on mediumship and what's possible. So the idea is that when someone passes over, they have to go through a process of disconnecting from this world, right? And they have to review their life. They have to feel all the feelings at an augmented level that they felt when they were alive. There's a whole teaching that are death teachings and what happens to the soul when it passes away. And what ends up happening is that there's sort of an astral shell of the person that will remain in kind of between the moon and the earth for a period of time. And it's kind of like an Akashic record of that person as that person goes on to their kind of death process. And in earlier periods in Lemuria, that didn't really necessarily exist. And the souls of deceased people were very obvious, and you could kind of interact with angels a lot easier. But as humanity has taken on more and more matter, and not just matter, but as we become more individuated, the eighth sphere around the earth, or the lower astral plane, has become more and more populated with basically nightmare stuff. So everything that the earth thinks, it kind of gets projected into the eighth sphere or the lower astral plane, and those become actual things. And so at our point in time, mediumship is actually very difficult. And that's actually what this question was about. It wasn't so much about how the soul dies and is reborn. And it wasn't so much necessarily about deceased relatives contacting you. The question was really about, at least how I read it, was, can mediums contact deceased relatives? So it's not so much about your deceased relatives being around you. It's like, can a medium, are they contacting a deceased relative in an animated sense, as that's where they are? And for the most case at this point, usually it's an astral shell that is being communicated with. However, outside of that ideology, you actually can be visited by your deceased relatives, right? They can be around you, they can be protectors. And don't forget, it's difficult to talk about this because they're outside of time. right? So how do we understand this when time doesn't exist for them anymore? So they could literally do all their visitations for you with you throughout your life in a minute for them and then pass on. So it's not an easy concept to understand, but your deceased, in my opinion, your deceased relatives absolutely do come around you. They come through angels. They're absolutely there. Also, your animals too. Your animals that pass away, they stay around you. They stick around you as well. This question was more about mediums contacting people, and what they're contacting. That was what the question was. Does that make sense? Okay, here's another member question. What is going on with Jupiter? Why is new Jupiter part of our planetary evolution? Why Jupiter and why new? Is there an old Jupiter, like in the other planetary timelines, risen and fallen? If yes, what is their story? Are these beings currently living on that sphere? And if yes, do they correspond to angelic beings in the spiritual hierarchy? When stargazing Jupiter, I get impressions that feel like memories of an advanced civilization. Is it our own timeline? Okay, so great question. So this is getting into the kind of cosmology and cosmogony of the anthroposophical system. And the planet evolves in something that's called a planetary chain. So the Earth actually began in what is called Saturn condition, which was basically just warmth, right? Then the Earth solidified a little bit more into basically a sun condition, what's called sun condition. Then it solidifies even more into the moon condition. And then we finally get the material existence of the Earth, which is the Earth condition, which is where we are now. We're about halfway through the material existence of the Earth. So this is why you kind of have to have an esoteric understanding eventually if you want to understand yourself and the planet, is because for the vast majority of our own existence, humanity and the planet's existence, we're basically non-physical. So this is why it's so important to understand spiritual science, because again, all of those patterns recapitulate in every civilization again and again and again and again. So this is kind of like the key to understanding the underlying patterns of yourself and creation. So Jupiter is basically the incarnation where the human being will become an angel. And it is basically an etheric existence, an astral etheric existence. So it's called a new Jupiter rather than, Jupiter. Steiner could have called it that because it's like a new Earth. It's a new embodiment of the Earth. But also, I think it could also be a kind of acknowledgement that every single planet, including Jupiter, Venus, Vulcan, all of those sort of earthly developments that are represented by those planetary spheres, they all have 7 different incarnations, just like our Earth does in this period. So everything always evolves in 7s. So this is talking about a certain round within the planetary sphere of Earth Jupiter, basically. Because Jupiter basically the Earth basically just kind of begins to expand and be absorbed into where Jupiter is. That's kind of how I understand it. And so the solar system is essentially like one big schoolhouse that is multidimensional or interdimensional or full of spiritual planes. And so, for example, when we have the influx of angels from the Venusian sphere in Lemuria or Eden, that isn't like representing the entire planetary development of Venus, which is Earth's future, really. That is representing one aspect, one developmental aspect of Venus interacting with the Earth. That's not the entire planetary sphere of Venus interacting with the Earth. It's one developmental aspect in which Venus and the Earth interact. So we have to understand that these planetary spheres have their own life. And there's a certain time when waves of human beings from Earth will merge back in. And that's why I believe it's new Jupiter, because technically it's a new rebirth based in transmigration of souls and the rebirth of the Earth in that Jupiter existence. Okay. Robertson, Robertson. Okay. Hi, Gigi. I'm so grateful you crossed my field of vision. Questions that I have had for a long time are beginning to be answered. I'm 66 years old and I've had many spiritual experiences off and on since I was a child. I felt very different. No one in my circle was talking about such things, and I was experiencing. I say this because my 8-year-old granddaughter appears to be clairaudient. How can I help her develop? I want to be here for her. Okay. So if you are sensitive, it's very likely that you probably felt like the black sheep in your life. That is usually the typical mystical experience. And it can be very, very hard on children, because the number one thing that's important when you have a child that is exhibiting mystical properties, they don't really need to learn to meditate. So meditation really shouldn't be taught until the child is older, like maybe a teenager into an adult. The most important thing for children is acceptance, and for them to be able to share with you their pure experiences, and for them to not be judged. So when you're dealing with little children who are mystics, it's very important that you don't judge them, that you don't ostracize them, and that you don't make them feel as though they're doing something bad. Because if you do, they will think that they are bad, because this is how they see the world. So when you tell a child that they're a freak, or that they're bad, or that they're weird, or you exhibit fear of them, or you ignore them when they're mystical, there's a potential there that they're going to hate themselves and dislike themselves, because they can't really change how they see the world and experience it. They can only suppress it or nourish it within themselves. That little soul is who they are. We can either encourage them to develop it in a good way by listening and not pushing a bunch of shame on them, right? And leading them properly, or we can make them feel like absolute freaks, which will damage them in their life. So when you're dealing with a child, especially like under 12 years old, the most important thing is to make them feel heard, understood, to play with them in their visions, and give them guidance, give them advice that you feel would have helped you at that age, keeping in mind that they are a child. But the most important thing is just listening and not judging them, because keep in mind that they have angels around them, and their angels are communicating with them. So as a caregiver, you're absolutely responsible for them, but they also have their angels that are around them as well to guide them too. So keep that in mind. Okay, Sally Smithern. I have a question about the destruction of Atlantis. I have a distinct memory of being involved in an anarchist group that sabotaged the crystal energy reactors. I always thought the multiple simultaneous explosions and the subsequent earthquakes and tsunami are what destroyed Atlantis. But now I hear about the Orion Wars and the destruction of Tiamat and the water causing the flood, etc. Could you discuss, please? Okay, so the idea of the Orion Wars and the destruction of Tiamat and the belt there, the source for that information, I believe, is Zecharia Sitchin. And I don't see Zecharia Sitchin as being a reliable source. I acknowledge that, I mean, it's a basic tenet in occult science that planets have life on them, and that life goes through an astral period, an etheric period, sometimes a kind of physical period, but that physicality may not be the same kind of earthly dimension as our own, right? But it is known in occult science that planetary spheres are developed to have life on them, but that life just may not be coexisting in the same plane as our own, because we're really in the earth plane, right? So there was a kind of destruction, that there were destructions that happened kind of in the solar system school, but those were called the battles in heaven, right? They began in an astral sense, but then had recapitulations that happened in a more material way. And it's not clear to me that the flood that happened during Atlantis was because of like aliens, and like a war between aliens in the sky. I think a lot of the galactic battles between, the idea that there's these sort of space aliens in these ships that are battling with each other, kind of how we would see pilots dogfight. That's not something that seems to be that I really resonate with. I think there's a lot of conflation there between the battle in heaven, between angels, that again didn't really happen in a physical sense. It happened in like the Merkabahs and energy bodies. Eventually, it got to a point on the Mars sphere where there was the externalization of the Merkabah. So all advanced technology is an externalization of the human energy system. So when people talk about like advanced technology, they are talking about basically a machine that is basically like a Merkabah. The way that it operates physically is how the human energy system operates. That's how that technology works at the highest level. And that began happening actually on the Mars sphere, which I will get into later in this month. But so I have to enter into things like the Orion Wars and the Sitchin material very, very carefully, because I think a great deal of the Sitchin material, the Von Daniken material, ancient aliens, I think it comes from the Mars stream, and it's the Mars impulse. And I think that it is heavily based in propaganda. I think it is more from these sort of inner earth beings from Atlantis that are fallen Belial group. And so I struggle to enter into anything that comes from that line as though it's like a good teaching that I would want to start with. I wouldn't start there, because I think that there's something called stewardship in teaching and discussing these things, which is that it's not really about whether Tiamat existed and was destroyed. It's not really whether cosmic events were involved with the fall of Atlantis. You could say that these are potentially true things. It's how you talk about them. It's the emphasis in which they're spoken about. It's more important. So how these topics are spoken about is more important than the facts in our time period. And so I think that these topics have to be entered into in the right way. And that is where we understand the destruction of Atlantis as being first an earthly event based on immediate things that we can understand, I think, and know. And then we can go into the esoteric too. But the I will say this. So when it comes to fallen angels and the sort of angels and the fallen angels, the time of Atlantis and Lemuria, it was really a battle for form. So a lot of the stuff going on was about having forms to incarnate into, having lines in which these higher angels, which people now call aliens, could incarnate into. And that was really what a lot of the battles were about on a higher level. And the crystal technology is the original crystal technology did not belong to Belial. Okay, so there's a point where a planet will develop into a higher level of existence where it begins to basically externalize internal forces. It begins to externalize processes that are internal. And this is called technology. So in the highest sense of the word, technologies are all supposed to help us understand ourselves by seeing these operations outside of ourselves. That's the highest level of technology. And so in earlier periods, like in Atlantis, the crystal technology is the Emilius group's technology. And it was created in a very specific way over time to basically be well, I won't get into that, but it was built up over a very long period of time, and it essentially belongs to the Christ stream. It belongs to the Emilius group in every way. What we have with the Belial is a parasitic desire to take over that technology and attach to it and control it because they're possessed by an externalization impulse, in which the only way the Martians and the Belial group could ever know themselves is through progressive externalization. They never learned how to turn it inward. And so technology is like a drug for the Mars group. It's like an addiction. It's the only way that they can ever get some semblance of understanding. So the most advanced technologies, typically items, they don't belong to the Belial group. The ironic thing is that their technology is actually inferior, because there's a point with all spiritual technology, and this is something that Dark Journalist has mentioned repeatedly. I've mentioned it for years on my channel. There's a point with higher technology where the only way that it can be truly get to a certain level is if the person's a very high initiate. And that's how it was in Atlantis as well. So it's not really so the fall of Atlantis really isn't about Orion wars. Okay, it's not about these aliens battling each other in the sky. That is the battle in heaven, and that's the battle of the angels. It plays into it for sure. What's going on other planetary spheres, does that play into what happens on Earth? Yeah. But it's not something that is what I would say in regards to stewardship and the order in which things are shared. It's not the main thing. It's not even a dominant thing. It's an interesting thing. But I think when talking about this topic, it's really about where is our point of power? So much of this becomes just entertainment. And when we're talking about these things, we have to say, where's our point of power in talking about this? Where is this empowering rather than just entertaining, right? So yeah, there's of course there's different connections between planetary spheres. There's been spheres that were, like with Tiamat, it was always going to fail. It was always going to destruct because it's like a female version of Mars, and it was always going to fail because with Tiamat, the forces that were pouring into it were the most imbalanced, crazy forces imaginable. There was no being that could live on it, that could harmonize it, because it was a reservoir for the most intense, crazy forces you can imagine. So yes, sometimes you get these planetary spheres that form where it's almost like they're not going to survive. They're going to fail because the polarization of the forces coming into them, incarnating into them, is so great that the planet fails. And then the life wave goes into a different sphere. And then there are certain things that happen later in the solar system's evolution where these pieces of the planet get kind of reabsorbed and reused. And just like how eventually the Earth will reabsorb the moon, and the sun will eventually reabsorb all of her spheres, his spheres. So there's deep mysteries around something like Tiamat. There's deep mysteries around what a moon is. There's deep mysteries around how the sun leads all the planets in evolution, which is the Christ being and the Christ initiate. There's a lot of very deep mysticism around what I think is trying to be gotten at in like the Sitchin material and ancient alien stuff, but it ends up coming out more like entertainment, and the real deep occult understanding that actually like goes into your being as an initiation just isn't there. And it should be. It needs to be. It's literally just, entertainment and fodder if it's not there. These topics are an esoteric topic. They should be spoken about as such and observed as such, lest they be dangerous. Okay. This is from Leah Katerina. I would like to ask how come karma and reincarnation is never mentioned in the Bible. For Christians, the meaning of past life or incarnation is viewed as a New Age principle or ideology and not the truth, while the concept of incarnation, so as karma, is very strong in esoteric Christianity and many other religions. Would love to hear your thoughts about it. Yes, great question. So the doctrine of reincarnation was not included in the sort of orthodox and dogmatic canon. It was not included. And there's a reason why it was not included. And in order to understand this, we actually have to look at the stream of spirituality in a larger sense in the world. And that when we get a religion, okay, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, those religions are not the thing. So Christianity is not Christ. It's not the entire teaching of the Christ being, the Christ impulse in entirety. It is literally a small fragment. And it is what the church fathers and the patriarchs of the church at the time chose. This is just the reality. It doesn't mean that there isn't amazing truth in the Gospels and the Bible. It doesn't mean that it's not a beautiful spiritual text. The same thing with other religions. But the first thing we have to understand, if you want to honestly understand the spiritual world and Christ, is that religions, including Christianity, is basically a compilation of spiritual documents and understandings for a period of time. So when you get Buddhism, it's the same thing. There were things that were chosen to be in Buddhist documents and in as traditional Buddhist practices, and things that were not chosen. And what happens is the kind of patriarchs or matriarchs of that system have to ask themselves and say, where is humanity going? So what does humanity need to become essentially in the next 1,000 years? And where have we come from? So, right when you get the incarnation of Christ, we've had, 4,000, 5,000 years of Eastern teachings in which we were coming off of Atlantis, which is a very mystical kind of consciousness. And a lot of the earlier Eastern teachings and a lot of Eastern teachings today have a character of basically in its worst form. Not everybody who adheres to Buddhism or Eastern teachings does this, but a large amount of people were basically disassociating from their body and disassociating from the physical plane and calling it Maya, illusion. So the shadow side of Eastern spirituality was disassociating from the physical form. And everything's Maya, everything's illusion. I'm just going to disassociate from my body and I'm just going to be absorbed back into the one all there is. This is temporary. So reincarnation almost became too important of a doctrine in the East, karma, dharma, and people were not taking life seriously. Also, it led to the incredible caste system. India had one of the most horrific caste systems and still has part of the caste system there, in which there was no social mobility because the individual was just not recognized. The caste system was so prejudiced in India that the higher nobility and the Brahmins couldn't even stand in the same room as someone with the lower caste. They couldn't even stand in the shadow of someone of a lower caste system. So if you were born into a higher, family or a certain race, you had, of course, you had a higher soul. You were a more advanced soul. That's the caste system. That's what it was based on. So the problem with that from a Christian perspective and where the earth is now is that's completely toxic. Christianity and what delineates it from the Eastern teachings is that it's about the individual, and the individual has to be singularly acknowledged and worked upon now in order to receive Christ within you so that you can become like him. And to become like him is essentially to spiritualize out of matter and be reborn in a higher spiritual body through transubstantiation in what is in a higher world, basically. That is the real esoteric reality of Christianity. So you have the Eastern teachings, which were basically not allowing, and not everybody in the East recognizes that. Part of that is because of the Western influence, though, on people to include the individual now and the natural desire to be individuated from the whole. But that wasn't something that was really truly augmented in the Eastern teachings as it is in the West. The West is about the individual. For better, for worse, we've certainly seen a lot of cruelty and darkness around this, just like the Eastern had its darkness too. But so the church fathers understood this and were like, we need to have people pay very close attention to the life that they are living now. They can't keep disassociating and saying, well, I'm going to reincarnate and just disassociate from your body, because you actually have to now transubstantiate your physical body into a glorified etheric body or a glorified higher body, which is called the resurrection body in Christian esotericism. So you actually have to do what Christ has done. That's the whole point. That's why he came here, to show us it's possible, to give us eternal life. You can't have that. You can't evolve to the next level of earthly and human development if you can't fully be in your body, if you think the whole 3D world is Maya. And you have these superstitions that were becoming really dangerous in the Eastern tradition. We don't see that in the West, because in the West, individualism has almost become a negative thing. So people retreat into Eastern thought now. But back thousands of years ago, when the church fathers were compiling these books, it was very important that people anchor into their body. And so this is why, in my opinion, the doctrine of reincarnation was removed. And Rudolf Steiner also talks about the importance of understanding unbornness, that the soul does have a life outside of the earth and goes through a period of unbornness, what is that like? What is that? And these are all things that even a basic reading of the Bible, you can understand there's a spiritual world, okay? The Bible is full of mysticism. What was Paul's experience at Damascus? That's a mystical experience. The Gospels are complete mystical visions. What's apocalypse? Okay, the Bible is a mystical book, but it's a different kind of mysticism than the East because it's coming from a different place, the place of preparing humanity for resurrection. So so this means that reincarnation is included in esoteric Christianity. It is not included in Orthodox and dogmatic Christianity. But esoteric Christianity is not dogmatic Christianity. It is different. That's something that people also have to understand. Yeah, the understanding of Christ is different. It's understanding the spiritual and mystical actions behind the dogmatism is what the esoteric teachings are. Okay, this is a member question. Could you talk about protection when doing healing and psychic work? I've worked in this field for about a year now, and lately I'm experiencing many health issues. I have a feeling that this is related to me not being able to protect myself properly while doing energy work. I even have encounters with dark forces in my sleep sometimes, but it hasn't bothered me until it started to affect my health. Do you have any advice? Okay, so usually if you're doing a lot of psychic and spiritual work, and you're kind of newer to it, if you start to get like darker dreams, if you start to feel tired, if you start to feel sick, that is a sign that you could be burning the candle at both ends. So one of the things that we have to catch as psychics is that we often think that we can, work spiritually with people the same way that we would work with our hands or in a mundane sense. And actually, spiritual work takes much more energy and it is much more tiring. Like sometimes if you do like a reading or two in a day, or you're working on something like teachings, that can be the equivalent of you running like a 5K marathon energetically. And the body can withstand it for a while, especially if you have built up a kind of power from past lives, or you just have a ability to endure. But over time, it can begin to break down. And so when you start getting physical pain, when you start to get bad dreams, this is your sign that you need to take some time off. And you need to go into the pain, and you need to go into the dreams, and you need to take some serious time off to understand why it's occurring. You never want to push forward. You never want to push yourself. If something's manifesting, you have to take the time to understand it. And so that's what I would say there, because it's not always easy working psychically to sense when you're burnt out. But when it starts manifesting as tiredness and things like this means you need to take a break. And if you're feeling like you need to protect yourself properly, that's also like you can have the best understanding of psychic protection. You can have all the charms and do all the things, but if you're run down and you're tired, none of that matters, because it really comes down, when it comes to protection, how you live your life. There's no charm, there's no little do ritual that's going to protect you more than just how you hold your mind during the day. your thoughts during the day, whether you're sleeping enough. So the best psychic protection is a pure and conscious life where you're taking care of yourself. Okay. This one is from Yona George Hobbs. My first question, if you get it, regarding incarnation and the elites. We know they reincarnate themselves back into their bloodlines. Is it possible for them to control the incarnation process of others if they have enough control over the person through their life, especially at the point of death when the soul leaves the body? What if they had control over the person's death, which we see happen through many events? Okay, so nobody can, if you are an individual who has your eye developed, you're an individual, nobody can like force you into really anything. What usually happens is that there is subversions. So like a black magician, they can't just like wave their wand or do a magical rite and absolutely control your reincarnation process, right? Because they're not God. And how we incarnate is actually based on very precise spiritual laws that no sort of lowly human magician or even the weird fallen beings they communicate with can really control. So this is why you get so much subversion around us all the time, is that what they can do is try to debase you, debase humanity into making them watch the most disgusting things, normalizing really dark, gross, debasing things, exposing people to dark spiritual forces, and basically trying to get people to come under a darker influence so that they hurt themselves, so that they begin to serve those forces. So we have to give consent, basically. And a lot of this is they try to get consent from humanity through subversion, through propaganda, through lies, through exploiting people's ancestral wounds, through making people feel, introducing horrible events that make people feel as though they're in survival mode all the time so that they can't develop their spirituality. So we're basically bombarded with all these actions that try to get us to abandon ourselves. And that's what gets people, is that they become kind of captured by it, and they never develop themselves. They become really captured by the darkness within themselves, really. That's what's really going on. So, even if you you do a sacrifice and take someone's life or something like that, they're still not controlling that person's soul. The only sort of exchange there would be that some of the elemental essences that are around that person and in nature would feed on a kind of substance that's produced at death. So they're not actually feeding on the person's soul, they're feeding on a kind of substance that's produced elementally when somebody passes in a violent way. So I understand why people think like, oh yeah, they're feeding on the soul of that individual or controlling it. It's actually more like an etheric substance that's created by these elementals that are sort of within the person and the nature, that it creates a feeding frenzy, but it's not actually the person's soul, it's a separate substance. Does that make sense? Okay, this is from a member. Hi, Gigi. I have frequent dreams that feel quite real every time. I dream of casting demons out of people or engaging in battles with them. Are these dreams revealing to me my past lives, or is this actually happening in the astral plane? Thank you. I would say both. I think that I know from my own psychic research and my own experiences that there are actually individuals who work in the light, who work with spiritual masters and very high spiritual beings that basically specialize in exorcism. And, you know, one of the most fascinating lives that I saw was actually a life in Egypt where I saw someone on like a healing table, and there was a great long, there was actually two, there was a big long, almost like the horns from Switzerland when they go onto the they go onto the Alps and they like blow into those horns. And there were smaller ones too, like little trumpets, but really basically shaped like a cone. And they could blow into them and basically create a sound. It wasn't just the horn, it was the way that the initiate would use the horn. And it would actually cast out demonic entities from the body. And so the practice of exorcism goes back a very long time. There were certain spiritual items that would help with the casting out of these lower entities that would attach to people. And it's a real practice in itself. Like there's a lot of spiritual disciplines out there. People look into the spiritual field and they think everything is the same. It's not. Even different psychics have different capacities. You're not going to get a psychic that specializes in health and looking like at the body like an x-ray be able to do the same thing that someone that specializes in reading the Akashic records. They may not even be able to do it. So we have to understand that our souls contain these abilities that are from other lives. And then when you're in your dream time, your soul just starts doing it again because that literally is like a chosen discipline. And so that's what I would say there. So pay attention to your dreams and what you're up to. Okay. This next question is from Nick Jacked. I've recently discovered the work of Alice Bailey, and it's astounding. I didn't see anywhere near as much acknowledgement of her as Steiner, Blavatsky, and Cayce. Are you familiar with her work? I only discovered her name because a paranoid truther channel on Twitter claimed the UN were using her 10-point plan to destroy religion globally, but I'm blown away by what I've read so far. Would recommend to all. Okay, so Alice Bailey is a theosophical teacher. She's a theosophical author and psychic. And of course, the Theosophical Society was started by Blavatsky in kind of the late 1800s, actually. And Theosophy is almost single-handedly responsible for basically every single teaching in the New Age. When you look at New Age teachings, including like Starseed stuff, that is Theosophy. That is basically Theosophy reduced down with terms changed into modern times. That's all it is. And with some Anthroposophy and Gnosticism in there too. So when Blavatsky passed, taking it into about the turn of the century, around that period, you get Annie Besant, who takes over Theosophy, I believe. And so then after Besant, you get Alice Bailey, who takes over the Theosophical Society. So that's the chain of command. So I actually think a lot of people are using Alice Bailey's work and quoting Alice Bailey's work, but not citing her. But again, you have to understand that Alice Bailey is extrapolating on Blavatsky, and Blavatsky brought the Eastern mysteries to the West. So that is basically like Blavatsky, Besant, Bailey, theosophical authors. They're really an extension of the Eastern mysteries in the West. The one thing that Theosophy did not do was teach Christ. Theosophy didn't understand the Christ impulse, and would place Christ incorrectly in the cosmos and Jesus incorrectly in the cosmos. And often the masters, the nuances of the masters was not developed enough in Theosophy. And that's where you get Anthroposophy breaking off and becoming the real impulse of esoteric Christianity in the West and in the esoteric scene, is because Theosophy was not able to develop that. And Blavatsky placed Lucifer as Christ in her material. She placed Lucifer as the position of Christ, basically, and which is incorrect for our time. And this made it so that people painted Theosophy as a Luciferic tradition. But this was because of Blavatsky's own placing of Lucifer as a Christ figure, instead of delineating who Lucifer is, who Christ is, and who Ahriman is. We don't see that come about until Steiner, who came out of the Theosophical Society and had to leave it because it was going in a direction that was basically not acknowledging the impulse of the time. It was just kind of trying to create a reemergence of Eastern mysteries in a time when we were moving towards, we really need to understand Christ if we're going to move forward. It's kind of like when Buddha reigned in the cosmos. We really need to understand Buddha if we want to, you need to understand the master of the time. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything at all. So, so Alice Bailey is really a continuation of Blavatsky and Besant and Theosophy. And for me, Christ is central to my worldview. I'm a mystical Christian. So I wouldn't particularly take anything from Besant or Bailey personally as something that I would necessarily quote all the time, because I'm not in the Eastern stream. I'm in the Western stream more so. So that's why I don't really get too into Bailey. However, I do enjoy a lot of theosophical authors. And I think that Theosophy has incredible value in going into understanding. There's good Venus teachings in there, actually. There's good stuff about the planetary spheres, which we've been talking a lot about today, because what it did was basically take a lot of those older teachings from the Vedas and Eastern initiation, brought them here. So it's not that there isn't good material there. I read a lot of theosophical literature. I read a lot of Eastern literature. I read a lot of mystical Christian. I read a lot of everything, and I think everybody should. But what you choose to teach from and what you choose to present to the world, you want it to be something that's very precise. You want to try for that, or at least I always want to, the best I possibly can. So the whole thing, I know, the thing about like mysticism is that everybody feels like they can peer their head into this field and knows everything about it. And you wouldn't do it anything else. Like you wouldn't go into like dentistry or cooking and start diving into it and saying how to cook this or how to do that. But that's exactly what happens in esoterica, is everybody pokes their head into it, oftentimes with not enough actual initiation to understand what's written. And then they form these conspiratorial ideas. when it's a complete misunderstanding of Theosophy, or it's a complete misunderstanding of Anthroposophy, because everybody just feels like they can peek into mysticism and understand it immediately. So what we see happening is that, unfortunately, a lot of the theosophical teachings by the 1920s were being used to promote communism. You see that happening with the Bolshevik movement and the Roriks, how they were mixing Theosophy and Bolshevism and communism that was building in Russia. And that was because Theosophy, again, never managed to integrate the Christ impulse properly. And so it began getting used for all of these political ideologies. And that's why you see people going in there. The number one criticism for Theosophy, including Alice Bailey, Besant, and Blavatsky, is that it's Luciferian. And that, again, is because they place Lucifer as the highest figure, or one of the highest figures, without fully explaining the Christ. That's actually why they were fighting with Steiner, and why Steiner left, is because they were offended that Steiner wanted to talk about Jesus, actually. So that has not aged Theosophy very well in certain respects, placing Lucifer in that position for many people. Other people don't care. They like it, they get it, that's fine. But for a lot of people, especially on a superficial level, it's an immediate no. And then the idea of spiritual science emerging in our period, which is what it's supposed to be, got twisted into things like Scientology. So basically, in the mystery schools, it was known that our era is going to be the era of spiritual science, or objectively understanding the spiritual world. That's what spiritual science is. You don't have to go through a priest, you don't have to go through a medium or a pythia. You can learn the dynamics of the spiritual world within yourself and you objectively. And you can psychically and spiritually develop through that inner knowledge. So that is the period that we were in after developing this objective consciousness, is to now objectively understand the spiritual plane. So different mystery schools understood that that was the initiation for humanity at this period. That's where you see Scientology come about. Yeah, because Crowley and Hubbard were connected, and they knew that this was the impulse of our age. So they come up with Scientology, mixing science and mysticism. You also see Theosophy talking about this. You see them talking about, certain things that are supposed to happen in like 3,000 years, which is like people supposed to, at this point, becoming the sixth race, and objectively being able to understand spirituality and God, and so being able to operate in the world in a much more harmonic way, because we all have a view and understanding of what God is. Therefore, we naturally behave more harmoniously. But the UN and all these places took that and said, yeah, I'm going to be God, and we're going to bring all this spiritual stuff about, but we're going to be God. And then they'll use these texts to support it, but that's not actually what they're saying. They're talking about it in a very specific way that these weirdo dark groups are distorting. It's the same thing with Nazi esoterica, where they keep bringing up the word Aryan and using it in this weird racist way, and root races in this weird racist way. This happens all the time with different mystical teachings, is you get people that come in that have hatred in their hearts. They're not prepared in their mind and their soul to understand what they're reading. And then you get this bizarre teaching, and it makes the teacher look bad. It makes the movement look bad. And then so many gems and so much stuff that is true, it just dies on the vine, literally because people don't know how to read, oftentimes, spiritual literature properly. And there isn't an understanding that the mind has to be prepared to read it. People think they can just go into reading The Secret Doctrine or Steiner or the Bible or Vedic texts like you would read a recipe. Not the case. Your mind has to be prepared, which is why you can read something one year, read it another year, and get something totally different, because it doesn't actually come from the words we're reading. It actually comes from information that's flowing into you based on certain things the words are stimulating externally. So that was a very long answer to an Alice Bailey question. But I mean, I don't think it's fair to look at any teacher and say this person's bad or this person's a god. I think you have to meticulously go into the work and study it and say it is very strong in this area. It's very strong, very well done in this area. This area of the work I don't think is as strong, and this is why. It's this influence and that influence. And so that's how you deal with a teacher, is you don't just decide whether someone's good or bad and make weird conspiracy YouTube videos humiliating them with like weird, like a all-seeing eye on the thing. This is childish. You look at the person's work and you have to have some level of esoteric understanding, and you say, this is strong, this is not, and this is why. That's what they deserve. That's what everybody deserves. But instead, everybody wants to be conspiratorial. Everyone wants someone to blame. Everybody fears their own wild spirituality within them on top of it all. So they want to be in a dogmatic tradition often, or they want an enemy. So there's a good minded way. Every person deserves that in their life, to be understood. At least try. No one's good or bad in that way. There's some wonderful things from Alice Bailey. There's some wonderful things from Besant, from Blavatsky, from Steiner. That's up for you to decide, but you're not going to be able to say, there are some times where I do come across some work that for me, it's just not true enough to spend any time with. But some of the classics out there, Manly P. Hall as well. I mean, he does obviously a very good job, but they deserve to be studied. And if you don't like something, figure out why, because there's a lesson in there as to why something is out of time, or what is the new influence that has been brought in that has made this less correct and this correct. That's how we learn, not by just being dismissive of people, right? Okay. Logan, do you think Steiner has reincarnated back on Earth? Well, he did say that he was going to, I believe, be coming around again. But then it gets into certain teachings about reincarnation. And I think to understand this, we have to understand the teaching of spiritual economy and the idea of the sharing of certain sheaths. Yeah. Especially when you get to a certain level of initiates. This is from Cecile. Did Rudolf Steiner mention that in this time, new Christ elements will come? Do you have any insights on this? Well, Rudolf Steiner really understood the Christ, and he really innovated and brought a lot forward on the Christ impulse. And the Steiner work is not going to see its time fully in the sun that it deserves for probably a little time yet. But the gift that he gave on that is, I mean, incredible. And one of the things that he's very clear about is that the Christ has actually made many different sacrifices for the earth. So we're so entrenched in the material plane that we just think about the mystery of Golgotha and the crucifixion. But Christ actually performed 3 other sacrifices in earlier periods as he began to descend into the earth and prepare to incarnate in Jesus for those 3 years and perform the mystery of Golgotha. So Christ actually sacrificed himself in a kind of transubstantiation into matter slowly 3 times. And he will do it again 3 more times. This is why understanding esoteric Christianity is key. So Christ now, the Christ being, now exists in the etheric plane. That's what happened to his form when he basically went through that sacrificial rite. So one of the ways in which the Christ impulse will now be received is by humanity through having mystical experiences with Christ. Through dreams, he will begin to appear to people. People will begin to feel his essence around them. Christ will enter into different teachers and different people and work through them. And so basically, that is how the Christ impulse reappears. So it's not about Christ incarnating directly into a man again. That already happened. That's done. That phase of the initiation for the earth is done. We don't repeat it. Christ is now alive in what is called the etheric world. And he goes through another initiation for humanity there, and he'll go through 2 more after that. That's my understanding of it. Okay. And in the Steiner material, this is the it's not pre-earthly sacrifices. Someone in the chat, please give me the correct terminology for that. But basically, we will experience him as though Paul at Damascus did. So the Paul at Damascus experience, the Paul experience is extremely important, because that's basically the experience that now we will all begin to have if our hearts are open to it. So that is the second coming. That is how Christ returns, is that he's entering into all of us. All right. So, and eventually moving forward in time into the later cultural epochs, we will also, certain people will begin to resurrect as Christ did. Not in the same way, right? Because that was what Jesus did is different than what the initiates in the future will do, but we will begin to do what was done there, which was the point of him coming. So we can learn the process of resurrection ourselves, which is possible. It is the basis of alchemy. That's what the alchemists were really talking about. So we're also getting certain waves of souls that are coming from the kind of mercurial Venusian plane. And these souls are from a certain round of Venus that are essentially, what's special about them is they're within the Christ impulse, so they're very high initiates, but there's an innocence to them, and they work very well in groups. So we're getting these souls coming in through the Venusian mercurial plane, and they are very powerful, they're very gentle, and the whole thing is that they're able to harmonize very, very well. And that is kind of their power. And they're able to work very well in a group for one purpose, for Christ, basically. And so those souls are all coming in now, which is also part of this. That's preparing for the future age of humanity where we begin to live in brotherly and sisterly love. So the souls that are going to kick that off, that are going to bring that impulse, are already coming in now, but it doesn't reach its height, begin to reach its height until we get the Russian Slavic epoch. That's when it begins to pick up more. But the souls are already coming in, which are technically further along in the Christ impulse development than we have seen previously. Okay, North Star. And they're male and female. Okay, it's not just in one sex, they're both. But anyway, I'll talk about that later. I could go on about that, but we'll move on. North Star. Hi, Gigi. I'm brand new to your channel, so I apologize if this has been addressed before. My question is tarot exclusively, quote, demonic and to be avoided, or does it have any utility if used correctly? Tarot. Okay, so tarot is basically a card system. It was actually an esoteric divination system that actually is supposed to have led to the creation of playing cards. So tarot is supposed to have predated playing cards, and playing cards actually allegedly arose from tarot. Now, tarot is basically a bunch of archetypal spiritual pictures that depict spiritual development. So you have trump cards that represent the larger kind of spiritual journey of life, and then that's broken down into 4 suits and then lesser divisions of that based on the elements. I think one of the problems that we have is people who belong to a dogmatic tradition looking at something that is outside of their world and immediately calling it demonic. And doing so almost as a knee-jerk reaction, not having spent one day, let alone a year, understanding what the system actually is. I mean, every single religion has rituals in it. Okay, if you look at Hinduism, they have tons of dogmatic rituals. Buddhism, tons of dogmatic rituals. Tons of items that are sacred that they use in a ritualistic way. Right? So every kind of spiritual tradition has that character, but what happens with dogmatic people is anything that's not within their particular dogmatism is demonic, which is not intelligent at all. It's not spiritual. It literally is a protection mechanism because they fear demonic entities. They don't understand how they work, and so they fear entering into something, and it's superstitious. Okay? Now, I would argue that there are definitely some tarot cards, occult books, and items that I would never have in my home. You know, like I'm not going to have something made by a black magician. Like I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to use those items. But not every single item is made by a black magician. Tarot actually, it's really interesting because there's sort of Christian hermetic books on tarot. There's one that's called The Christian Guide to Tarot, which is an esoteric Christian view of the fool's journey. Yeah, I personally do not think that tarot cards are inherently demonic. I think that if somebody is a black magician and makes a tarot deck and then infuses it with weird energy, I think that could potentially work upon you, right? But I think it's short-sighted and superstitious to say that every single tarot deck, including its invention, is created that way, right? So it's the same thing with like yoga. People will say, you know, if you're doing yoga, you're like summoning a demonic entity by doing yoga. This is not serious. I mean, you can't be serious. Okay, some of these things are superstitions. This is a superstitious comment. This is not a measured, deep understanding of what yoga is or of what tarot is. This is a superstitious comment. Okay, if you want to say that tarot is evil or that yoga is evil or that anything outside of a dogmatic thing is evil, then I want to hear exactly why. Esoterically, I want to hear exactly why. But there's never exactly why esoterically. It's just a superstitious comment. Because everything outside of that person's decided worldview is evil. This is sort of a self-protection mechanism. Again, we want to lean on spiritual science and occult science rather than dogmatism. Because when you understand how the lower plane works or how the demonic plane works, you can operate properly. Superstition arises and dismissiveness arises when we don't actually understand the spiritual dynamics of something and just go into self-protection mode. There are things that are legitimately evil. There are evil objects that I would say are created out of evilness. They're part of black magic rites. That exists. But the only way you're actually going to understand that is by understanding occult science and what the lower planes are, what a lower being is, what black magic is. You don't have to practice it, but you have to understand it. And then you can understand if there's a higher version of it. And you may choose to never pick up a deck of tarot cards. I don't do a whole lot of tarot readings or anything like that, but they're not evil, right? They're a bunch of archetypal pictures that represent spiritual and human development that are designed to, when you look upon them, allow you to communicate with your higher self and your subconscious and your angels. And a lot of people can do very incredible healing work through tarot, because it's basically just you communicating in a sense with your mind. That's what it's for. That's what divination originally was. Like divination is communicating with the spiritual world. There's positive and negative ways. Okay. This is from Humberto. I got some very beautiful artwork, Saints and Angels, via Temu. Cheap, but very inspiring. But I found out it was all made by AI. I'm a bit conflicted about this. Any thoughts? The beauty actually matched some of my intense spiritual experiences. Interesting. So I'm not somebody that thinks that like everything created by AI needs to be thrown in the trash and that it's evil. I'm someone that says I think we should pump the brakes on it. And I think it's being developed by people who see computers, AI as being a religious ceremonial item for them. This is something that a lot of, I think, people who don't venture into spirituality incorporate, is that a lot of the individuals who are behind the development of AI, they refer to it in occult ways. Okay, so you have Geordie Rose, who literally likens the development of AI to summoning demonic aliens. This is from his own basically recruiting video. It's on YouTube. There's been many statements like that from him. He calls it the abyss. The abyss is the word for black sun in occult literature. You know, you have Yuval Noah Harari, who I think he did one lecture and featured a picture of Jesus behind him and talks about how eventually AI has to be, and computers, their eventually highest purpose and our eventual goal is to upload your soul into the cloud. This is not a normal conversation about computers. These are not normal conversations about AI. These are religious conversations about it. So it's not that you couldn't develop a computer system that was like helpful, or like have a robot like flip your pancakes or something. It's not about that. You can develop technologies that are helpful, that don't intrude on spirituality. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing people like, for example, perhaps even Elon Musk with Neuralink, things like this, that are mixing spirituality into technology. That's not technology. That's spiritualizing technology, which is something different. So I think that we have to approach it with caution, because you cannot look at somebody clearly ceremonially developing AI, especially knowing what happened in Atlantis when the same thing happened and the same entity is like looming around waiting to be embodied in a computer again, essentially. You know, you can't use that kind of language. You can't be like, oh yes, we're going to, you know, be at like the World Economic Forum and be talking about how you're going to upload your consciousness into a machine and we're going to be the Internet of Bodies. I mean, this is sick. This is people who think the machine is the next part of the soul. So because that is the culture in which AI is coming forward and this hyper-technological age is coming forward, it's a religion for these people. You can't just say it's a neutral thing. If it was a neutral thing, you wouldn't be uploading like your consciousness into it as though it's a resurrection device. That's not neutral. That's literally a spiritual, religiously created object made by people who I wouldn't trust to watch my dog. So it's not it's not a computer that's a problem, or like the idea of AI. It's how it's being brought out, and the fact that it is a ceremonial object for these people. And you just have to spend 5 minutes watching various different people who are part of developing it and how they talk about it before quite honestly that becomes obvious. So I wouldn't say that you have to like throw away, anything that's created by AI, or you can't use Chat GPT. It's just you have to be aware of what it is and go into it knowing that, right? That's what I would say. Okay, this is from Catherine. Did Rh negative blood result from the alien ape hybridization? And did this hybrid group start to interbreed with the true humans, causing many of us to have this blood type? Okay. So most esoteric traditions acknowledge that there was a time period at the end of Lemuria where basically Lemuria being the period on Earth that represented animal consciousness. So in Anthroposophy, the kind of animal soul or animal consciousness is called the sentient soul, which basically means that human beings had basically a parallel level of consciousness to an animal. Human beings were not an animal. So human beings at this time were not apes. They were not animals. They were not part of the animal kingdom. There were animals on the planet, but human beings were not part of the animal kingdom. Within every human being, despite them only having a sentient level of consciousness, was the seed of their own higher evolution within the human being and on an etheric level. So there never was a point where the human being was an animal. There never was a point where the human being was really in the animal kingdom. But at the end of Lemuria, there was a period where there was a mixing of animals and humans. Now, it's in some teachings, it comes through mating directly. It's not clear that that's how we've reinterpreted it from our period. In other periods, in other texts, it's explained a little bit differently. And it's more like a sort of almost like entities enter into human beings and cause these grotesque creatures to occur. But when I look back at it, this actually happened many, many, many different times, kind of over and over and over again in slightly different ways. And I will be getting into this later on in this month, because while I'm working on the Mars line, the first corruptions actually happened spiritually. So the first kind of corruptions of the human line came from basically fallen angels that wanted to influence and gain power over humanity without sacrificing any of themselves. And so they entered into the human world. This isn't like necessarily in a spaceship or anything like that, but they entered into the human world through basically overshadowing human females. And this caused the production through dark magic, through dark sexual magic, of basically Nephilim or atrocities. So back in that early period of Lemuria, reproduction and humanity was not like it is now. Right now, everything is so set in stone that it really doesn't matter what astral forces you connect with, you're going to get a human baby within certain characteristics. But back in earlier periods, humanity was such an astral and etheric form that if you had a fallen angel stand behind you as a woman and you were merging with that fallen demonic essence, you would literally produce a child that was like a monster. There'd be something kind of garish or wrong or imbalanced about it. So the first kind of black magic sexual rites occurred with some women in Lemuria that were essentially fallen priestesses, because not everybody in Lemuria had split into dual sexes yet. So these were actually fallen higher priestesses that began this, because humanity as a whole doesn't start to become dual gendered until Atlantis fully. That's when the gate closes. So no more animal parts, no more dual genders. I mean, no more androgynous beings. So you actually had people being able to split gender and everything properly in Lemuria, but these were the more initially advanced people. And so there were some priestesses, and this is during the Matriarchy, which is why it was so devastating, that began, instead of working with the Father and with the Christ impulse, they began to work with fallen angels. And this is because these women were very jealous of others and they wanted worldly power. And this was kind of the fall of the feminine. And they began to produce, through parthenogenesis, a kind of dark parthenogenesis, this dark line of humans. And they were abominations because they were not coming from an earthly father, right? When that was just beginning to happen. And they weren't being produced through the natural parthenogenesis of the father creating a holy child inside of a high priestess, which went on from Lemuria all the way into Atlantis, and even some people were able to do it into the post-Atlantean period for certain for certain things, for certain souls. So you get these two lines forming on the earth immediately. You get these darker women who are basically mating with literal demons. Now, it's not, again, sexual reproduction in Lemuria is not like it is necessarily in Atlantis and now. You could become parthenogenically fertilized by a fallen essence through Zeus's lightning bolt, which is the phallus of the father, which is like an electrical spiritual impulse that's it has a fallen angel in it, basically. And so this was how the fallen angels were trying to enter into the human life wave, but everything, because they're impure, and they were not very developed, they were creating abominations, Nephilim, dark things. There was always something grotesque about them. And basically they were always getting naturally dying or getting killed off, or the planet would swallow them up or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that we look back today at something like the Nephilim and these myths of fallen angels at various different times of human development, mating with women, and it doesn't happen in a physical way, and it didn't just happen once or twice. This is the goal of the fallen angels, and it started in Lemuria in the matriarchal age with women basically bringing forth all these abominations. And this also is, well, we'll get into it more with the feminine mysteries, but you immediately get these two rivaling forces, these two, even if you could say, battling angels there. Later on, you see the fallen angels, I think, work more directly through later Atlantean period modifications and stuff, but there's also with the Martians, with the angels from Mars, the Martian influence. There was an esoteric period of influence of Mars. And to be honest, I'm trying to parse it all out. I'm trying to understand it. So there's very little influence. There's very little that is written about this, compared to Venus, compared to Lemuria. And so I'm having to basically go into a mystical state and observe this the best that I can. But when I go into a mystical state, everything is compressed, like very tightly. And it takes me time in order to separate out every single event and every single thing and to parse out the order in which they happened. So I'm going to be lecturing on this whole process of the matriarchy and how this began, how those dark seeds began, and also the Martians and exactly what that external influence was and how that happened, because there's an entire process there that I really feel like has to be taught correctly, but it's so massive that it's like I'm trying to get at it and I don't want to say anything that's misleading. So I can just say that there is an esoteric component of it in which these sort of darker beings that were really fallen from a lunar influence and from a Mars influence and even fallen Venus that were impressing themselves upon humanity, which is a process of a dark parthenogenesis or dark immaculate conception, which was possible then. But then these lines are able to carry essentially the entity that fathered them. Does that make sense? So if you create this dark baby from a demon, like a Rosemary's Baby kind of thing, and a Rosemary's Baby and like the Babylon working, this is the same stuff that's been going on since Lemuria with these fallen angels trying to incarnate into humanity. And so, but if you can create a human line with your seed through that lightning bolt, then, you know, in those earlier times, then you can get incarnations going. That's how I understand it at this point. But there's also a higher line that was going on in Lemuria and Atlantis of extremely exalted females that that basically created the line of Christ and the line of true earthly kings and masters. They created the forms for those beings, those people, those men, those sons of the sun. They created that line too. So you just can't get mad at women and say, oh my God, women, you know, did the dark parthenogenesis birthrights and had like, you know, darker influences come in. Well, yeah, but you're forgetting about the Mary line, and you're forgetting about the fact that there was an incredibly powerful women who were also doing that, and you would not have gotten Jesus had those women not done the higher work in the matriarchal age too. Okay, so it's important to understand both sides there. So when it comes to the Rh negative and blood, that's much later, but the Rh negative story is only understood through Venus and Eve. It's actually, people think that, because this is how saturated the Mars narrative has become. You know, you can't go anywhere in the New Age without people being like, the Rh negative blood is alien blood and it's from off planet and human beings are just dirty apes. It's completely the opposite. Okay, the pure Rh negative blood is the blood of the mother. It is the blood of the pure human earthly being. There's nothing alien about it. When you start getting fallen angels, which by definition, those are more alien because they're literally outside the life wave if you had to give a term to it. That's where you start getting these bizarre and desperate beings that are desperately trying to incarnate into the life wave and mating with the Liliths, which is another word for the ape women that fell in Lemuria. They couldn't even connect with a higher priestess woman because they're too impure. So they had to connect with these fallen ape women. That's how I understand it. Now, how it happened, I'm still trying to flesh out whether it was a spiritual thing or a physical thing. I'm still working that out, but I will lecture on it as soon as I have it. I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments if you have any insight on that. But yeah, so the Rh negative blood is not an alien blood. It's not the Anunnaki blood. It is actually the real angelic, human, earthly blood. And this is this weird ancient alien stuff that tries to make these human aliens holy while human beings are like dirty monkey people. This is ridiculous. This is not reality, and it's a fallen angel ideology that's designed to exalt themselves. Okay. Peony. Hi, Gigi. I'm curious about how to know my soul history and the spiritual world. I want to experience it myself, but I get confused about how to develop these abilities in a way that honors our human body of today. Good question. So, one of the most incredible things about the psychic development process and spiritual unfoldment is that it really develops gradually. So, all you have to really do is basically set the intention that you would like to know something, whether it be about, past lives, whether it be about your soul's purpose, um, whatever it may be, you just have to set the clear intention that you'd like to know it. And a very good way to do this, if you're new to it, is to do it before you go to sleep. So when we go to sleep, basically we enter a naturally psychic state, a dream state, a picture state, a naturally clairvoyant state. And for developing psychics, it's incredibly powerful to learn to work with your dream state first, because even when you go into a working trance state, so like if you're reading the Akashic records or you're doing a working mystical trance state, there's a level when you get into it where even if you're fully conscious, like even if I'm talking now, I'm not fully in my waking state. Everything to me is a little bit like a dream right now. Okay. That's the working psychic state. You have to get used to that. And then when I go for a walk after this, I will slowly come back into my body. I mean, I'm in my body. I never leave my body when I do psychic stuff. I'm embodied. But you don't necessarily feel that way. You feel very expansive. And so you sort of have to get used to how that feels. And a good way to get used to it is working with your dreams. And so you can ask a question before you go to bed, and then you pay attention to your dreams. And this is how you work with it, and you get better and better at it. And then through meditation, you can get stronger and stronger at building up a healthy trance state, right? While you're fully in your body. And then watching and working with impressions. And eventually it just builds, and you can build it and build it and build it out to become more dynamic. Angie, can we truly ascend if we are tethered and married to someone who only pretends to be interested in the spiritual things we are interested in? Or are they just anchoring us like drowning underwater? Okay, this is such a good question. Your partner does not have to be interested in absolutely everything that you're interested in. And sometimes how relationships work is that opposites attract a little bit, and they have a certain quality that you're looking to develop, and you have a certain quality that they are looking to develop. So it's sort of like your souls want to harmonize, right? And the most important thing is not, in my opinion, is not that your partner understands every dynamic of the astral plane and everything on a spiritual level. The most important thing is that your partner loves you and respects you and doesn't keep you away from your spiritual studies. Doesn't make you feel like you have to choose or make you feel like you're like a freak. At that point, that relationship could be unhealthy, right? So they don't have to be able to get into the depths of every single thing, and I don't think you should expect them to. But you do want them to love you, to respect you, and to support you, even if they don't fully understand. And this is where you can find a friend group where they do understand you. And you can have friends in a social circle where that is the outlet in your life, where you talk about spiritual things and you are able to explore yourself, explore these topics with people, with friends, right? And then you come back to your relationship and your marriage, and you love that person, they love you, but marriage does not mean that you share like every single interest intensely with each other. um, but if you do have separate interests, you shouldn't, you know, make it harder for that person, if that makes sense. Okay, Crystal. How do we know where our soul originated from and information about past lives and world origin, etc.? Can we access through meditation? A lot of people talk about Akashic records, but make it seem so unreachable for most. How do I access this myself? Okay, so our soul, so basically, because we're incarnated on the earth and we're an earthly being, we are always going to basically understand our soul in relationship to our current life. So, in order to access that information, those teachings are basically in, you could look into like the various books of the dead. So, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian books of the dead, give a little bit of a taste of where the soul goes after death. Because when you say, where does my soul come from? You're talking about the soul basically in its unborn condition. So you're talking about the soul in heaven before it takes a life. And heaven is laid out as different planetary spheres. And every planetary sphere is an expression of the sun and a different development of basically the soul. And so if you want to understand that, you have to get into that. Now, Edgar Cayce talks about it in his book, Planetary Sojourns, right? And you can also learn about it through Rudolf Steiner's Cosmic Memory. And there are certain waves of souls that kind of incarnate on the earth from certain planets at certain times, but they're pretty massive waves, you know. But a lot of it, like, where does my soul come from? Well, this is sort of like understanding your unborn self. So understanding your I and your soul before it's born. Well, that's understanding heaven. That's understanding the solar system as a school and the different planes we occupy as we prepare again for reincarnation. That's what I would say there. And you can access that through meditation. Again, you have to quite firmly and in a clear state of mind state what you are wondering. You know, you can't be distracted. You can't say it just passing. You have to actually take a moment and essentially become very clear, very quiet, and really set the intention, really build it up and say, this is what I want to know. This is what I want to know this week. You know, please show me in my dreams. Please reveal this to me. If I am not prepared for this information, please prepare me for it or show me where I need to develop in order to grasp what I'm wondering. And then pay attention to your dreams and pay attention to any kind of intuitive insights that you get. Like one day you may get an intuitive insight to like eat a certain food. You may get an intuitive insight to go for a walk. You may get this impulse to talk to someone on the phone, to go somewhere. Sometimes when you ask a question, the answer doesn't come right away, but your angels and your spirit guides will sort of guide you to certain places so you can have a certain experience, and then the knowledge comes in. So that's sort of the mystery of how things will work. So you may not get kind of that aha moment, that understanding, until a few months later or a year later. but you went through all of these experiences, maybe traveling or meeting different people, or you see a show or read a book, and that actually prepared you to finally get it. Because so much of this is not about information, it's about a process that needs to be developed within you, and then what you think is the information happens, if that makes sense. And the Akashic Records is something that you have to essentially learn to read. It's a specific psychic talent. It is being able to see precognitively, so deep into the past, and also sometimes deep into the future. And in order to really, the secret to reading the Akashic Records is to understand cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis and the larger schemes of development. This is why I'm pretty much a broken record with this, because you cannot read the Akashic Records in a meaningful way unless you understand how the planet develops over time and exactly what kind of consciousness was developing in humanity in this period. Was the earth etheric or solid? What does that mean? So in order to read the Akashic Records, you actually have to have an incredibly sound understanding, scholarly understanding of the planetary epochs of human consciousness. So in Anthroposophy, this is taught as the sentient soul, the intellectual soul, the consciousness soul, which is basically describing the capacities that humanity developed over time that characterize that age. Because as soon as you start reading the Akashic Records, your etheric body and your astral body basically has to enter into that prior condition to a degree. It doesn't become it, but it begins to bounce off of it. And there's these kind of sparks that fly as you're peering, as you're looking, as you're working, because your consciousness now is naturally interacting with an older consciousness, because you're not just peering into something like a video, you're experiencing it with your entire being. So you have to know what's going on an academic level to interpret it, period. Okay? Or you'll experience something, but you will not be able to describe it properly. So you may as well not have experienced it at all, right? It's like all over the place kind of interpretations. You see something, but you have no way how to describe it. It's a genuine experience of the Akasha, but you have no ability to talk about it because you do not have the lexicon in which to do so, which is spiritual science and understanding the epochs, cosmogenesis, anthropology, all that you have to know. Otherwise, there's no lexicon for it. So, all right. So we're going to do a few more here. I hope everybody's having a great time with me this Sunday. And don't forget that if you like this, I do this with my members every second Sunday. And we actually go a lot deeper into some of the questions because, YouTube does tend to censor and flag videos. It's actually been getting kind of weird with that. So do check that out. It's also a great way to support me and make sure that these videos can keep being made. Also sign up for my newsletter to know when I'm going to be live and anything that I've got going on, so you stay in the loop. All right. This one is from EHMM. I'm a longtime listener, and this is my first question. Well, welcome and thank you. There is a spiritual war happening. One sample is one side is Enki followers, and there's Enki is bad. On the other side, there's Elohim is bad, and one side is Elohim is good. Please explain what's going on. Thank you so much. Well, has anyone ever wondered why there is such a resurgence of the Babylonian religious iconography? Has anyone ever wondered why so many of these ancient aliens people always talk about Babylonian gods and Babylonian creation myths? Why? Why are you choosing Babylon? Sumeria and Babylon are the same stream at different times. Why? Why are we being introduced to the Babylonian religion again? And being told that it's a more pure version of the Bible. It's a more pure version of spiritual teachings because it's older. There is a massive movement behind the whole talk about Enki and Enlil. This is just the reintroduction on a core level. We'll just start off here. This is the reintroduction of the Babylonian esoteric tradition, the Babylonian religion, and the reintroduction of Babylonian gods and the Babylonian worldview. Now, the Babylonian period is a lunar period. It's a pre-Christ period, and it's the period of the highest and darkest magic impossible. I'm not going to lie to you about that. During the Babylonian era, we saw the most advanced kind of dark paganism imaginable, where every aspect of the cosmos, every star, every planet could be named and known in its individual power and used ceremonially. Every herb, every animal, every angel, every elemental was known like an index, and the most intense and dark and dangerous ceremonial magic was developed during that time period. And this is why when Christ comes to power, he says, listen, no more sacrifices, no more of this, because the kind of older Babylonian, which is kind of a form of a very advanced paganism, kind of beginning to get into the one God ideology, but still carrying this very fallen version of paganism. It's not even original paganism, which was a different thing. It's like a prescriptive way of having a dark ceremonially magic stuff. It is the epitome of people wanting to play God and commanding elemental forces and cosmic forces like the magician. And then you get the incarnation of Christ to basically no longer need to do these crazy magical rites and try to wield every natural force like you're a god, because the kingdom of heaven is now within. You don't need these rites. Everything becomes an inner potentiality. Everything becomes an inner process connected to an emotion, connecting to something higher. And a completely different track of human development begins. So why are we in the New Age community, in the ufology, repeatedly being drawn back into the Babylonians and Sumerian tradition? I mean, well-meaning people keep reintroducing this symbology and gently, slowly trying to bring this position forward. Why? The battle of brothers like Enki and Enlil, the solar brother and the lunar brother, literally exists in every single creation story and myth. And the Babylonian creation myth had an earlier myth. And there was an earlier one to that, and an earlier one. There's nothing special about it. Every single civilization will come up with a slightly different version of the same myth, right? So the Elohim are the Elohim are not aliens. The Elohim are actually essentially the name of, they're technically kind of beyond archangels in their essence, but they're very high angelic beings from the spiritual hierarchy that are not fallen, right? There's a difference between a fallen angel, which in modern parlance is like distorted and deformed and profaned now into like negative ETs, which doesn't really make sense, but fine, we'll use it. That is what people are saying the Elohim are, which is basically, Zachariah Sitchin's work. Zachariah Sitchin's work, which is basically 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 Zachariah Sitchin which is basically profaning Zecharia Sitchin's work. And so it's basically this system of even going deeper and deeper into profaning and matter, just getting weirder and weirder the entire time, just profaning the idea of the heavens into like this bizarre thing. So if you want to know about the Elohim, I would suggest reading Rudolf Steiner's Genesis. He actually goes in and breaks down what the Elohim are to the Hebrew writing. It's 7 lectures or something like that. So if you really want to know what the Elohim are, which is a Western term, you can check out Genesis by Rudolf Steiner, which for much deeper, comprehensive explanation than I can give today. But the Elohim are basically angels, formative angels, who are taking on the rays of the Father, the 7 rays of the Son, the Father, and the Son, S-U-N. And we are made in the image of them. Now, this actually is about, at a certain point of human development, the solar angels basically pouring in their part of their essence into humanity to become humanity's etheric template, in which how physical beings form is there's first like an etheric template that is formed. This happens when like a baby is being formed in the womb too. It's the exact same process. So first what happens is there's like an etheric matrix that's formed. And that etheric matrix has like a cord on it that goes into even yet higher planes. That is basically a higher being. And it pours itself into the etheric matrix, giving it an archetypal pattern. And that becomes the etheric Adam, or the etheric human of the earth. And then souls incarnate in through that. And so when they say we're made in their image, that's what they mean. They're actually talking about a pretty intense esoteric process of literally creating the template of humanity in an etheric form, and then humanity incarnating through that. So it has literally nothing to do with genetic engineering, or like good or bad. All of that is just like a profaned, materialistic attempt at trying to get at that using only what's available in the material understanding, and at that, the lowest level of that. So there's always like, even looking at some of the First Nations myths, there's always these stories of these battling brothers, the sun brother, the moon brother. This exists literally in every tradition over and over and over again. But what is really going on here is fallen angel behavior and the Mars impulse, which tries to basically glorify fallen angels as angels and creators of humanity. And they're working through the Babylonian system. And if you understand the Rudolf Steiner material, the angels that fell in 1878 or 9 represented the Babylonian impulse. They were Ahrimanic, but they represented that old lunar Babylonian impulse. And they basically take on that Babylonian impulse and they use it with all their might to destroy the Christ impulse, because these fallen angels cannot enter into the Christ stream. Okay? They're not advanced enough. So they can only take and embody the last impulse of the earth, which is that moon period, and the highest level of what could be done with the moon period, which is represented in Babylon and even earlier Sumeria. And they must take that, and they must take everything they can with that to fight and destroy the Christ impulse, and to return humanity to this, what they think is a paradisical condition, which is really just a degeneracy, because you can't return humanity. Humanity has to evolve, and we only evolve through the Christ impulse. So this is what's going on. There's absolutely a bizarre, nonsensical conversation that goes on about the Elohim, which has nothing to do with what the Elohim actually are or our ancient past. And then also in the Enki and Enlil story is getting profaned to bizarre proportions, with some of the most strange things I've ever seen and heard. And I just think it's a sign of the times. Okay, so I think I'm gonna do, what do you guys think? 2 more? We've been going for like, I guess 3 hours or so. Okay, I'm gonna do 2 more here. Patricia Cat, where do our pets, especially cats, go after leaving Earth? Could you talk about the connection with our pets, especially cats, from a spiritual point of view? This topic, not very explored in general. Thank you for everything you do. I actually did a cat question, almost this exact question, last week, and we were on my members website, and we were talking about how the Egyptians worshipped cats and Bastet. And I'll just repeat this one thing, which is that in the Indian traditions, in the Eastern traditions, which is interesting because, as we know, the Eastern traditions retained certain things like the doctrine of reincarnation and a lot of sort of mystical cosmic secrets that the Christian doctrines shunned at the time. The church fathers knew about it, but they chose to not include it in their doctrines. And one of the things that because the doctrine of reincarnation was taught so well, or retained in the Eastern teachings, they said that there were 4 animals that basically were in their last animal incarnation. And then when the life wave came around for the earth to reestablish itself, they would incarnate as human beings. So they would be kind of like the new beings of Lemuria, the next sort of Lemurian-ish period of the earth, long after it comes around again. And these 4 animals were cats, dogs, horses, and elephants. And so this is why very early on in humanity, human beings began to develop this close relationship with horses, elephants, dogs, and cats, is because from a spiritual perspective, humanity understood these animals are going to be human in their next incarnation when the wheel turns again. And so it was considered a great, loving thing to do, to have an animal and domesticate them and to basically have them be around you and to love them and have a relationship, because it was basically teaching them and showing them humanity. And it was going to make it easier for their soul to incarnate into a human form when the earth would reset itself and go through its 7 phases again. And at that point, you see the animal souls will begin to take a human form, and certain ones that are ready. And then you see, according to occult science, you see obviously elemental kingdoms moving into perhaps yet a higher elemental kingdom, or the mineral kingdom. Mineral kingdom moves up to plant kingdom moves into animal kingdom, and souls that are beginning to get ready move into the human kingdom. The human kingdom at that time moves into the first angelic level. So the solar system is a school for souls. And so cats have always had extremely mystical properties. I feel I just saw a spirit looking in my window. Okay, so maybe it's a cat spirit. So cats have always had this beautiful ability to see spirit. And there were different, especially in the Matriarchy and even places in Egypt, where they believed that the cats would see spirit and also protect the priestesses and things from negative spirits. And I think they still have temples where they have cats and things like that. And animals are basically their own kingdom of life. So it's not that animals aren't spiritual. Animals have their own kind of spirituality and their own beauty, just like plants do and minerals do and elementals do. which are considered the lower kingdoms of life, not lower as in lesser, but lower in that, in the level of complexity. They're not as complex as humans. And in the sense, humans are not as complex as angels. Okay, so when like an animal dies, like when a cat dies or a dog dies, they go through their own process. It's the same kind of process that we do, but it's experienced a little bit differently. It's not as complex. And you can actually have your pets, if there's a great love bond that you have with them, like you form this strong connection, they actually will stay with you, and they can be protectors. They basically can hang out around you in the astral plane, and sort of like what we were talking about with deceased relatives and stuff, your animals can actually stay unified with you and can actually learn from you and be around you, kind of taking in the humanness of it all. And so there's typically, you're right, there's typically not a whole lot of teachings on animals, but we do know, I did read this really funny thing in a theosophical book that was talking about mediumship, and the medium said that one of the reasons, this is like kind of a crazy out there thing, but it's so fascinating. And at first I was like, this is crazy, I don't know if I believe this. And then the more that I thought about it, I was like, I actually do believe this. And the medium said, she said that that one of the reasons why developing psychics get it wrong is because they have connected with canine spirits like dogs or their pets, and their pets will sort of like come around them and give them information just to please them. And it's not necessarily correct. It was just this crazy explanation. I'll have to try to find it and reference it on social media or something, but it was pretty funny about how she was talking about how she would see people's, you know, animals around them, and the animals were, these pets adored them so much that they would give them spiritual information, but almost what they wanted to hear. And so it was interfering with certain psychics' readings. And she was saying that you have to learn to discern from these animal essences, these animal pet spirits that want to give you information that you want. It's pretty wild, honestly. When you start getting into psychic work, it does get pretty interesting in that way, but it always stuck with me for some reason as an interesting concept. I haven't had any personal experience with that. I can't say whether that's true. It was just an interesting little tidbit on animals and the astral wanting to give messages and stuff, but really just to please you, that I just found really almost like adorable. But I don't know if it's true or have any experiences with that. I wouldn't teach it, but it was just a little tidbit. Okay. Up to, I'm going to leave it in Wolf's hands. Wolf will choose if we carry on or if we do shout outs. Okay, this is from Johnny Bardo. Hey, Johnny. And you said, hi, Gigi. I know Steiner talks about time not existing as it does today in the deep past, but I'm curious about general chronology of Lemuria and more so Atlantis. I know that the Atlantean epoch ended around 9,500 years ago, but when did it begin? Anthroposophists and Theosophists vary widely from tens of thousands to millions of years, while Cayce sees the Atlantean period beginning around 200,000 years ago, peaking after 50,000 years ago. I haven't deeply dug into chronology and time and numbers. That would be a different exercise, because understanding the chronology is a different psychic equation than understanding human development. It's a different stream, really. And so it is very interesting because Blavatsky dates Lemuria to be like 18 million years ago, which is a humongous number. But we also know that as the recapitulations carry on, they get faster. So it's actually very possible that Lemuria could have begun 18 million years ago, and that ginormous number is correct, because she's also using those texts from Tibet and India as well. And they're said to be pretty, I mean, they didn't use the terminology that we use, like they use Manvantara for one cycle, the breath of Brahman. They use euphemisms and these interesting terms, but they did have a mathematics for it. And basically, when you look at the Wheel of Time, the earlier epochs are incredibly long, like millions and millions and millions and millions of years. And development happens very, very, very slowly. But then as soon as we come into matter around, humanity starts to, the way that Steiner describes it, it's pretty funny, because he says that first you see humanity's like legs. Like if you were on the earth during Lemuria and you were more dense, you would like see these legs walking around, or you just see parts of people. And that's when the human being begins to basically form as we know it. It begins to materialize literally from the ethers on the earth. Basically from a higher aspect of the earth, begins to materialize with the earth. And that happens about midway through Lemuria, around halfway through. And then everything begins to speed up incredibly. And Rudolf Steiner describes this in Cosmic Memory as a crisis where the earth is beginning to speed up and development is speeding up very quickly. And the moon must be separated from the earth in order to basically keep development balanced, because there were forces that were in the moon that were fallen. And the earth at the time was more like an egg, and the yolk and the white had to be separated, and that becomes the moon and the earth. And these fallen beings were within what's now the eighth sphere, basically, but that happens when they get separated from the earth. And that harmonizes the kind of quickening that was going on. So the ejection of the moon had a very practical purpose for consciousness. And so once you get that, though, you get the speeding up of development. And technically the epochs become shorter. That's my understanding. When you go into like some esoteric schools, like esoteric Nazism and stuff like that, it gets like everything happened in the last 100, everything, Lemuria, like some teachers say that like Lemuria, Hyperborea, they get them mixed up and say that they were all in the last like 50,000 years. So you have that extreme too, where literally people think it all happened in 50,000 years, which is also too far. That's my understanding there. So basically what I'm trying to say is that in earlier periods of development, like the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean epoch, the first part of Lemurian, everything happens so slow. But then there's a massive speeding up because you have all these recapitulations, almost like a snowball, getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And so it looks to me like probably Cayce's take on that would be closer, because what you're getting is a quickening in development. So you're getting so in other words, I don't think the time is exactly the same per epoch. I think that what could be going on, and this is just me thinking on the spot, is that there's a quickening that happened, and so the epochs may actually be a little bit shorter because the epochs are not based on time, which would be considered to the early scholars too materialistic. The epoch would be based on technically the spiritual development of a certain capacity. That's my first guess, but 200,000 years ago, and then peaking 50, and then falling I think that would perhaps be closer, but I have nothing detailed on that because I have not personally gone into a working state and looked at it myself, felt into it, and come to a conclusion. But that's what I can say there about timing not being equal on both ends. And it's interesting too, because in Atlantis, for part of Atlantis, like I said, it was in a mist. And the earth was divided into quadrants, basically, of different kinds of mists in which different kinds of humans lived. And so there's such a mystical nature to it that it's like hard to imagine. But yeah, I would probably lean into Cayce's a little bit more, but understanding that the planet may not be operating in the way that it is today, and so to use it kind of lightly. But again, I'd have to go in and like see it myself, which I have not yet done. So this would just be a guess. Okay. Here's our last question, you guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me this Sunday. It has been so much fun. I hope you're having a good time out there. Wyatt, how do men experience spirituality in contrast to women? Specifically, how does the negatively charged etheric body react to spirit compared to the positively charged etheric body? Is the split of positive and negative charges concrete within our physical and etheric bodies, or do they mesh and have bits of each? What a phenomenal question, Wyatt. Are they polar opposites or more like the yin and yang, containing small pieces of their counterpart within them? Well, now you are getting into the chemical wedding. You are getting into all of the good things. So I think a very important teaching for our time is to understand the significant difference between men and women and the male form and the female form, which is something that there are certain movements in the world to destroy. There's movements to destroy polarity, because it is only when you understand polarity that you master yourself, right? So in occult science, in temple cultures, there were different traditions for men and women. Only at a certain level would men and women actually be in one occult society together. Mostly they were separate, and that is for a reason, because you actually have a slightly different function. Now, the more humanity moves forward, the more those things mix up. So in very early periods of development, human beings operated very true to their form, meaning that women have a positively charged etheric body, and men have a negatively charged etheric body. They are creating a chain of polarity that allows spiritual connection, which is why some of the modern arguments about men and women being the same, sure, there should be equal opportunities and equal things like that, but men and women are not the same psychically at all. We have a completely different setup. Men don't have a womb, first of all. So that's part of psychic operations for women. Even if you lost your physical womb, you still have an etheric womb that is operating. And men and women don't have a real phallus that's developed. So there's a type of precision and mental force that may not be available to them as easily as it is in a male form. There are differences. The more a soul develops over time and becomes more and more advanced, you see those differences disappearing. And you see men being able to be just as psychic as women. And there are men on the planet that are so developed in their feminine essence that they are more psychic than most women. There are some women who are so developed in their masculine essence, it's so balanced, that they have more intellectual development and discernment than most men. So it does get to a point where there is little pieces of each, but that has to do with the soul integrating its masculine and feminine aspects life after life, which is the male aspect begins to slowly save the damsel in distress or reabsorb his feminine aspect into himself. Now, I don't want to get too much into that because there's some very weird stuff around that, which I cannot ethically get into today or really describe. But it's about the integration of the two and that how that process goes over basically millions and billions of years. It's not happening today. You don't reach the, the androgen today. That happens over a very long period of time after many male and female lives are honored in basically a higher dimension. Okay. So essentially the difference is at this point based on the individual. But if you really want to look at the differences, you'd have to go to earlier periods of development in which they were more pronounced. So I'll just do it through the female. Women are basically, in a sense, designed to spiritually communicate with higher worlds. The most mundane example of this is that they bring life to the earth. They literally create a baby. Again, it begins as a little etheric imprint, a little matrix. It forms into a human being. They give birth to it. And they literally have created life on earth that extends into esoteric power, occult power, to bridge the worlds. That is the esoteric reality of women. And some souls would have to wait to incarnate into a female form to be able to do that and experience that in very early humanity. And the male forces and the male incarnation, the power there is, there's definitely priesthoods, but there's a special power towards statecraft and creating the structures of heaven on earth. And basically being the builders. And so there's different paths for both. And so I can answer this in the best way, probably through describing the traditional position of the oracle, which is that you have a female initiate. Okay, so you have a female high priestess, right? When she is attuning to higher worlds, she is attuning to basically the male aspect of her own soul, which is stored in the etheric body. And you could say that there is certain spiritual powers that is coming through that, if that makes sense. So there's certain connections through her male aspect that comes in there. This gets into the idea of spiritual masters, these male higher initiates, and the father. So it's through that positive and negative polarity that she's able to receive those forces. And usually when males incarnate, they incarnate with the power of their divine feminine. So whatever they've developed in their last female life, they'll have that with them. So when you see like these traditional pictures of like Blavatsky or these oracles that are surrounded by these masters and saints, that's because her etheric body is positively charged. It is male, so she can interface with these higher saints. And as the soul ascends, you ascend in the positive polarity, which is the male form. You descend in the feminine form. So you have these ascended masters, or the ascended masters in the New Age are what in esoteric Christianity would be the saints. It's the same thing. And so you have females via their polarity, they're able to connect with the Father and with the saintly realms, which are the ascended humans. That's how they appear. And so it's, I hope I'm answering your question. Yeah. So over time, like I've mentioned this in on my membership site as well, where there was a time in earthly development where men were not psychic at all, and their whole focus, the male form's focus, was basically on establishing heaven on earth. So creating systems in the community, leading, that would eventually allow human beings to operate as though heaven is on earth, kind of thing. I don't know how else to describe that, but in mystery teachings, it's considered to be statecraft, which is how to lead people and bring spirit to the earth, or it's called the architect. So you're trying to build heaven on earth, really, through creating the right structures in which freedom can exist, in which women are safe and children are safe. This is what men, that is the original spiritual power of men, is to allow spirit to flourish and to create the structures in which it can happen. And that's actually a very high spiritual act. And without that, nothing can exist here. And that's where you get all the knights and the priestly orders and the teachings about statecraft and all of that. It's about creating the higher spheres here in this world of pain and sorrow, and creating the right structures for that. That is the spiritual power of men. And so eventually men become able, though, to do spiritual feats, but initially that power was kind of given to them by women in very early periods of development in the matriarchy. And so some men began to develop these incredible powers. And then women learn how to develop their mental abilities, because that was not women's strength very early on. We had more of a dreamy focus. This is going back in Lemuria. This is not, 2004. This is the development of the human being. And then so through her male lives and through enmeshing with her positive aspect, you learn to integrate as a woman, to have a very powerful mind and a very powerful intellect, which was usually something that was in the male incarnations. And so they sort of come closer and closer together as time passes. And that leads to the integration of the soul back into one, if you will. And there's so much more around this that made these things possible. There's so many more teachings around things like statecraft, right? And priesthoods and priestesses and all this kind of stuff that happened in earlier periods. But I'm just very lightly touching on it now. And it's kind of a weird thing to talk about, because it's like nowadays, if you say things like this, you're like a racist or something, or you're hateful. I don't know. It's really silly. So please don't be offended. I'm not being hateful. I'm just, trying to talk about the differences between the genders and the forms, which were very obvious in Lemuria, very obvious in Atlantis. And only in the post-Atlantean epoch has it been possible for, and obvious for, the different individuals to have such well-developed male and female aspects that rival each other. It's only in our epoch that we've really been able to do that. So, great question. I had an absolute blast with you. Let's go into some super chats. Thank you guys so much for super chatting and supporting the work. Thank you, Ramada Sa. Thank you, Burman Teacher. Thank you, Dario Darkangelo. Thank you, Doyle Wayne, Andrew Hu Kamau, Hukamau, Sylar, and Jenny Runco. Thank you guys so much. It's been my absolute pleasure today. And make sure you sign up for my newsletter so you know when I'm going to do another one. If you like this, don't forget to sign up on my website. I do this every 2 weeks. We have forums where you can discuss all this stuff with like-minded people. We do all sorts of activities. It's a blast. So we have a really great community going on over there. Great discussions. I think that's it. I think that's absolutely it. Don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the things. And I will see you all next time.